All right, welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A, which is obviously not my real name, but I've been going with it for a while now, and we're gonna keep on using it until I decide to change it. So I wanted to get a stream going about Christian doctrine, mostly. Other topics. If other people have other topics they want to discuss, maybe we can go into that as well. But I think it's been a while since I had a stream where I focused on Christian doctrine and what Christians should believe. And this is on the heels of a debate that I had about 2.5 weeks ago now, where I debated the deity of Christ. And I'm still kind of a little bit surprised about the response. Now, I should, I keep this in mind. I'm not a very significant figure in YouTube. My channel's not very big. It's actually pretty small. And not everyone. I can't assume everyone has seen the debate that I was in. But I do know that a lot of kind of the bigger players watch the channel that I was on and those debates, and a lot of them are very interested in the deity of Christ. And a lot of times after a debate, not just on that topic, but on almost any topic, I'll see them like reviewing it and talking about it, and obviously highlighting how their side did well. And most all of them are Trinitarians, and the channel I was on is basically hosted by a Trinitarian, although the debate itself was neutral in its structure, and it was unbiased. Both sides are allowed to basically have equal time to make their case. But I've noticed that it's almost like the debate never happened to these people. None of them is talking about it. None of them is making comments on it. None of them is bringing me up as they usually do the debate participants and talking about. I don't know. It's really interesting. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe I'm reading too much into it just because it's me and like I want to like see how people respond to what I've said. But I feel like I'm just trying to interpret it. There's a number of things that could be going on here. Number one, obviously, is that people just haven't seen it and thus they aren't talking about it. So that's probably the most likely explanation. But another possible explanation is that as a Unitarian, I'm considered a heretic, a pretty bad one too, because denying the deity of Christ is basically, the devil's doctrine to these people, to the Trinitarians. And I think that a theory that I have, and this might just be my own ego, a theory that I have is I actually wiped the floor with that Trinitarian so bad that their only response is just to ignore what I said. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. That's just my, me like trying to puff myself up. But it's one theory I have because I haven't seen anyone trying to deal with the arguments I made during that debate and trying to establish how I'm wrong or anything like that. Now, of course, there are probably people out there who have done that, and I haven't seen it. And obviously, I'm sure that a lot of the Trinitarians who even watch my channel will probably have their responses as well. But as far as these kind of bigger players and people with larger channels who are constantly discussing the Trinity and talking about how, basically Christianity is believing the Trinity, which is absurd because nobody in the Bible, literally nobody in the Bible taught the Trinity. What do you mean? Well, yeah, no one in the Bible taught the Trinity. Now, the Trinity is derived by piecing together various verses in different parts of the Bible and piecing them together. And when you put them all together, you're left with a situation where you theoretically, according to how they see it, where you have to believe the Trinity because it's the only logical conclusion based on everything that's being said. But there isn't a single individual in the Bible who makes a statement to the effect that God is a Trinity, or tries to teach people that God is a Trinity, or that the Trinity exists, or that to be a Christian you must be a Trinity. No one says anything like that in the Bible. So these Trinitarians out there who are trying to say that basically Christianity equals believing the Trinity, they're just making stuff up. That isn't to say the Trinity is false, but it is to say that no one in the Bible seemed to care if people believe the Trinity, because not a single person in the Bible taught the Trinity or said any or explicitly mentioned a Trinity, a Trinitarian Godhead, or anything like that. And as I showed in my debate, there are tons of statements in the Bible, including by Christ himself, which pretty much refute the Trinity. So I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if maybe they just didn't see the debate. That's one theory. But part of me thinks that some of them might have seen the debate and were just like, they didn't know how to respond, and they were disappointed by the person I debated. So therefore, their responses, instead of being like, "Oh, he made some good points. Maybe he has a point. Maybe his arguments are valid." No, their responses to ignore it and continuing to deceive their audiences. Which I know that they're deceiving their audiences, and I know that they're engaging in deception, because I've seen things behind the scenes that just make me think that these people just are not being genuine. Like when they host open panels and they say, "Come challenge me," and I try to join and they boot me without mentioning me or saying my name. And I think that's extremely dishonest and disingenuous. People like Kelly Powers, who I haven't seen him in a while, and people like Matt Slick, and these various others who pretend that they're hosting open forums. And if someone they know who gets the better of them quite frequently joins, they will silently boot them and ban them and block them and pretend that they're taking all challengers. People like Kelly Powers and Matt Slick and a few others. Not everyone does that. Some of the Trinitarians will take anybody, but there's a couple of fraudsters out there. So people should be aware of that. Before we get into Christian doctrine, by the way, if Kelly Powers wants to debate me or come on my channel, he's welcome. I just want to put that out there. A couple others too. Matt Slick. They probably won't see this, but I just thought I'd throw it out there. Yeah, they don't watch my channel. They kind of stick to their own castles, where you have to go to them and basically approach them. They're not going to show up on my channel. They're not going to watch my channel. They're in their own little echo chambers. Kelly Powers, Matt Slick, a couple others, those types. Anyways, by the way, yeah, I just had to challenge them to a debate. So if they want to debate me, that's fine. Or come on my channel. I want to get into some news before we get into the Christian doctrine. So part of being a Christian is trying to figure out ways to make the world a better place. Now, that could be said about a lot of different worldviews. Even the atheists will claim that they're trying to make the world a better place. And, I think they're probably being honest when they say that. A lot of them anyways. But certainly as a Christian, we're commanded to love our neighbors, love God first of all, but also love our neighbors. And loving people means trying to do what's best for them. So there's some news that's going on, and I honestly think that politics is part of that. I think that it's not necessarily politics like, oh, be a Republican and the Democrat. No, it's not like party politics. It's like politics is essentially choosing who runs the nation and who makes the laws. And the people who are running the government, their decisions affect everybody. So I do think that being part of a Christian means participating in the electoral process and making sure that the people running the country are basically doing the right thing. Now, obviously, people are going to disagree what is the right thing. But whatever the right thing is, we should try to make sure that the people in power are doing that. And I think everyone can agree that reducing crime and basically protecting the public and things like that are part of what even not just Christians, but basically anyone from all walks of life would agree that reducing crime is what makes someone an effective governor. So I want to talk about some news on that effect, about things that I'm seeing in regards to the Trump administration and things that are happening, and how I think that we're seeing a lot of positivity as a result of things that Trump is doing, but were not happening under previous administrations. So I do want to take that little departure and show people some information that I think will be effective. Because again, you could say, politics has nothing to do with Christian. Why are you talking? No, it's all related, because if Trump is doing something that is making people's lives better, that is I would think, what God would want and what Christ would want. And if it's something that he's doing but wouldn't be done by another world leader, then we can effectively say that electing Trump is the Christian thing to do, if only because he's having a positive impact on the country. So what am I talking about? Let's just talk. And also, this comes on the heel in following these so-called No Kings protests that we saw this last weekend, which were kind of a joke. People pretending that they're fighting some sort of tyrannical dictatorship in the Trump administration to make them feel like their lives have some sort of value, I guess. I don't know. It's pretty delusional. I saw a number of interviews with the people in these marches, and very few of them were able to basically explain clearly what Trump is doing that is violating people's rights. A lot of it has to do with his immigration enforcement. He's kidnapping people. He's just taking random people, brown people, off the street and throwing them in prison and deporting them to Africa. Kind of crazy stuff like that. But obviously, that's a bunch of nonsense. And very few of them were actually able to answer what Trump is doing that's authoritarian, what he's doing that is outside the bounds of his role as president, as the leader of the executive branch. A lot of them mentioned the government shutdown that's currently ongoing, but the Democrats are the ones who are not voting for the spending bill that's on the table because they want more spending. By the way, the current bill that's being put forward by the Republicans just continues current levels of spending. The problem is the Democrats view the government as essentially a slush fund for their allies. So they want all these basically billions and billions of dollars and more spending so they can send them to their friends who are basically going to refunnel it into Democrat coffers. So that's what the Democrats are essentially doing, is holding America hostage so they can get their money back. Because when Trump got in there and Elon got in there, they basically cut all the funding to all these useless NGOs that basically are just Democrat front groups. And that's really hurting them. So what the Democrats' plan now is to basically shut down the government until they get their money back so that they can continue using it to funnel their own efforts. They'll claim it's because they want to help people, but I'm sorry, that's just not the case, because we know that a lot of the money that they're asking for is just going to be refunneled to these liberal activist groups. And some of it probably will be used to help people, but a lot of it, that's just, they have to do some actual work. You can't say funnel it all to themselves. So let's just take a look at some things that are going on here. This is a story from literally today. 480,000 criminal illegal aliens arrested since Trump took office. Now, the thing here is the total of illegal immigrants arrested is 408,000. And according to this news source, every single one of them is a criminal. And how do I know that? Because of what it says right here. 70% of those arrested have criminal charges against them or have been convicted of the charges. So the Trump administration has arrested, since he took office, 480,000 illegal immigrants. Of those 480,000, 70% of them have criminal charges against them not related to their immigration status, which is insane. So think about how many people that is that are running around in our country who are literally pretty much convicted criminals. And I'm going to show more examples of this. Basically, they give a few examples in this new press release that was hosted by Kristi Noem. This includes Eric Carlos Ramos, a criminal alien from Cuba. DH said he was convicted of homicide, kidnapping, robbery, armed carjacking, driving under the influence. El Salvador national Oscar Marroquin, also arrested, previously convicted of sexual assault of a child and driving under the influence. Various other these people. Arturo Morales was taken into federal custody, has been convicted of lewd and lascivious acts with a minor, incest with a minor, and driving under the influence. So these are some sick, monstrous people running. And you know what? These people, what they do is they run to these sanctuary cities where immigration laws are basically not enforced. So these sanctuary cities are basically havens for these sick, twisted, evil people in our society who are here illegally. And they are protected by Democrat politicians because they know that the Democrats are not going to enforce legal immigration. So these disgusting people who've committed these crimes run to the cities run by Democrats, and they're safe there. And what Trump is trying to do is get rid of them. And the Democrats are working very hard to protect them, which is obviously a dangerous thing to do because these are dangerous individuals. So that's that. So a couple of individual. Look at this. This is from October 16th, 2025, which is just like less than a week ago. ICE federal partners arrest more than 1,400 illegal aliens in Massachusetts during Patriot 2.0, including murderers, rapists, drug traffickers, child sex predators, members of violence. So this is something that happened in Boston over the course of September. The ICE went into Boston, which is a Democrat-run sanctuary city, and arrested 1,400 illegal aliens in the sanctuary city of Boston. And a lot of these people, as we learn, are involved in organized crime, transnational organized crime, gangs, and egregious illegal alien offenders. So a lot of these people, I was reading the press release, these are extremely violent, dangerous people. And more than 600 of these people arrested has significant criminal convictions or pending criminal charges for crimes committed in the United States or known foreign fugitives. This is taking place all over the United States. So this is basically a 1-month operation in one Democrat-run sanctuary city, Boston. These murderers, these drug dealers are hiding in these places controlled by the Democrats, and they are running rampant and committing all kinds of crimes in the United States and hurting people. And the Democrats are fine with it because they view illegal immigration as a benefit to them because they intend to make all these people voters. And of course, who are they going to vote for? The Democrats. So this is what the Democrats are doing. They are creating an extremely unsafe place by protecting these violent illegal immigrants who are in our country, shouldn't be in our country in the first place. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but so what you're saying, what is the evidence that these people are so violent? Well, we can see it all over the place. Well, first of all, let's look at this. All right, let's take a look at some news information that I just think is interesting. This is from September 25th, 27th, 2025, so about a month ago. Baltimore records 100th homicide amid significant drop in homicides for the year. Isn't that interesting? Baltimore has recorded its 100th homicide for the year, marking a reduction of over 30% from the same time last year. The city is on track to see its homicide rate drop for the third consecutive year, sparking debate over who deserves credit for the improvement. So, of course, we're not going to give Trump credit. But it does mention that the rate had been declining. But this is going to be almost a record year in terms of Baltimore and its homicides. 30% is a lot from the same time last year. Okay, so Baltimore was known as a massive crime city. What about this one? This is from October 15th, 2025. That's San Francisco, another sanctuary city. Building on, okay, they're not going to mention Trump here, but I'm just trying to draw a trend line, show you some trends. With crime is dropping statewide in California, okay, and we know that Trump has been basically doing a lot of immigration enforcement in California. I'm trying to find, where does it talk about? Oh yeah, here it is. According to Major Cities Chiefs Association, overall violent crime in major California cities is down 12. Oops, did not mean to do that. What did I just do? Back. Okay, there we go. 12.5% in 2025 compared to 2020. So crime is dropping all over California, not just largest. Look at this. The largest overall declines in violent crime were reported by police departments in Oakland and San Francisco. Oakland is down 30% since last year. San Francisco is down 22%. Violent crime is plummeting all over the place. Now, what's causing this? This is from Denver. Let's look at Denver. Denver is a major sanctuary city. Denver sees drop in violent crime and auto thefts, FBI data shows. This is from August 10th, 2025. Just a few years ago, Colorado led the nation in auto thefts, but new FBI data shows significant progress. With car thefts dropping by more than 30% in the past year, violent crime is also on the decline. Look at that. Look at this. The city's murder rate fell by 49%, almost half as many murders under the Trump administration as under the Biden administration. I shouldn't put it that way. This year compared to last year. That's how the news agencies are going to frame it. They're not going to make that connection. I'll make it for you. Trump has reduced Denver's violent murder rate by 49% compared to when Biden was president. That means half as many innocent people are dead under Trump compared to the failure Joe Biden. All kinds of types of crime are down this year in Denver. Look at Dallas. Violent crime down 14% compared to last year in Dallas, police say. Look at this. The Dallas Police Department says there's been a 39% decline in murders from this time last year, July 23rd, 2025. Dallas local news. Violent crime is plummeting all over the country. So I could go on. There's other major cities who are seeing major declines in violence, but what do we notice here? Violent crime is plummeting massively ever since Trump took office and starting enforcing our immigration laws and removing these violent, evil people from our society who go around and carjack people and steal and murder people. And he's taking them out of the country and sending them back to where they came from. And it's helping our country. It's all these people. Think of all the people whose lives have been saved thanks to Trump getting elected and not Kamala Harris. If Kamala Harris had been elected, these numbers, I'm going to go ahead and make the claim that none of this would be happening. She would have basically opened the floodgates to more illegal immigrants, and all of this stuff would have continued to happen. None of this crimes decrease would be observed. It actually probably would increase, and people would continue to see violent crimes, carjackings, thefts, and of course, murders at pretty much the same rate. But because Trump was elected and he's enforcing our immigration laws, and a lot of people committing these crimes are illegal immigrants hiding in cities run by Democrats who are creating sanctuary cities. Trump, this is what these lunatic liberals going around protesting Trump and his immigration, they're actually protecting murderers. They don't understand Trump is going through and removing these violent criminals, and the left is going apoplectic because these violent people are being removed. Black Atheist is with us. Good to see you. We got Rebuke and Reprove, Eastern Thomas. Good to see y'all. I'm going to go on a little bit further. Now, y'all remember when Trump deployed the National Guard to D.C.? And everyone was saying, oh, it's Trump being a dictator. He's being, just like these no king rallies, Trump's being a king. He's sending the troops in to oppress minorities, all of these things. Let's look what happened. This is the local news in Washington, D.C., where Trump first took action to sending troops to deal with crime. Look at this. This is from August 20th, back closer to when that stuff all started. But National Guard's presence slashes DC crime rates with 7 days homicide free. And that's obviously something that's not to be expected in DC if you know anything about DC. It's very high crime area. So the recent deployment of National Guard in DC has led to significant decrease in crime, despite initial skepticism from locals. The crime is minimal here. Oh, well, the city has experienced a notable decline in criminal activity. For the first time in a long time, DC has gone 7 days without a homicide. Carjackings decreased by 83%, robberies by 46%, car thefts by 21%, and overall violent crime is down 22%. So Trump's actions objectively saved a lot of people from these horrible criminal events and activities. And what is the left and what are the Democrats doing? Complaining about Trump being a dictator, complaining about Trump being a tyrant who's abusing his power. They would rather see these violent criminals continue to victimize people than have Trump actually solve the problems that they're allowing to occur under their leadership. When you have these numbers going down, it means this is a success and people feel safer, said Sergeant Betsy Smith of the National Police Association. All right. So this is from CBS News. So this is from, oh, that's just not going to work. That's not going to work. Do it this way. August 27, 2025, CBS and analyzed DC crime data amid National Guard deployments. Here's where the numbers show. In the nearly 3 weeks since President Trump deployed federal troops and law enforcement agents throughout Washington, D.C., a CBS News analysis of crime data shows violent crime is down in Washington by almost half when compared to the same 19 days in 2024. Now, remember, what are the Democrats saying? They're saying everyone hates Trump because he's being a dictator. He's sending in the troops to round up minorities and throw people in jail, and he's a fascist. Look what he's actually saving a lot of people's lives. Beyond violent crime, reported burglaries are also down 48%, and car thefts have fallen 36%. Trump is saving a lot of people. Trump is saving a lot of people. Okay, well, 3 homicides compared to 7 homicides. But look at this. All of these, look at vehicle thefts, robberies from 2024, 112, 2025, 42. I mean, I guess that's an entire year versus half a year, but anyways, this is a Trump truth. The FBI this is from today, I believe. The FBI under my administration is doing an incredible job. Since January 20th, more than 28,000 violent criminals has been arrested, record-breaking, with over 6,000 illegal weapons seized, more than 1,700 child predators, and 300 human traffickers taken off the streets. 5,000 innocent children rescued, 2,000 criminal enterprises disrupted, 1,900 kilos of fentanyl, enough to kill 125 million people, taken out. Historic results. We're bringing law and order back to America. Cash, Dan, Andrew, and the men and women of the FBI are doing a tremendous job. Make America safe again. That was from Donald Trump today. So how long are the troops supposed to be there? I actually can't answer that question. But from my understanding, the fact that they're there is having a lot of positive results. So I don't know. I don't see a lot of people complaining about it at this point who actually live there. Now, the Democrat politicians want to make it look like what he's doing is outrageous and dangerous, but he's actually, like, we just looked at the stats. It's actually having a tremendously positive effect. And I'm sure the DC residents are aware of that. So all these people out there protesting Trump last weekend, these so-called No Kings protests, which are a joke, excuse me, they act like all Trump is doing is sitting in the White House, being Hitler, being a bad guy, nothing good is happening, he's just oppressed. It's just not true. a lot of really good things are happening, but because of the media in this country and how politicized things are, no one wants to give Trump credit for the really incredible things that he's done and all the positive things he's done. And it's not just crime. There's a lot. I mean, you could argue with some of the stuff he's doing. I mean, nobody's perfect, but just look at all the violent crime, the decrease all over the country. And people don't want to give Trump credit because he's Donald Trump and he says stupid things from basically all the time. But if you look at the policies he's enforcing, well, no, I wouldn't. Would you rather have the military in the cities instead of police? No, obviously not. But I would like to see if there is a serious crime problem. I would like to have it solved by whatever means necessary. And there's no evidence that Trump is actually violating anyone's rights by doing this. And he has made it clear that he doesn't intend to have this as a permanent solution. So it seems to me like the mechanisms that Trump is employing are basically being done appropriately, and they are having an indisputable positive impact. I mean, we just looked at the numbers. So once the troops, well, the solution I would say is to elect people who do what Trump does, which is to be tough on crime and not go light on crime. Like, it doesn't have to be Trump doing this. It could be Democrats. The problem is the Democrats, for whatever reason, feel the need to not take crime very seriously in their own locality. So, yeah, it would be nice if the Democrats would just enforce the law and do the right thing, but they're not. And it's leading to situations where a lot of people are suffering because of their policies. And Trump is cleaning up the mess that they made. So what's the solution? Stop electing people who do what they do and actually, enforce America's laws and stop protecting the criminals and the violent, illegal immigrants in this country. That would be my solution. But people actually have to recognize that Democrats are the problem to do that. And how many people are willing to do that, especially in these large cities where they've been programmed to think that Democrats are the ones protecting them, when really it's the other way around. Anyways, but good questions, Black Atheist. I really like your questions. What do you mean by tough on crime? Tough on all crime? Basically not treating the criminals as victims of society, like punishing them for their activities and sending the police in, not tiptoeing around things because it's politically incorrect. Like, all Trump did was essentially send people in who would enforce the laws. But you have to understand the liberal mindset, Black Atheists. I don't know if I'm not. Liberal mindset is that people commit crimes because society oppresses them. And that means they're victims. And that means you can't be tough on them because they're just doing the best they can in the situation they've been given. They're pretty much forced to do what they do. And that's a bunch of nonsense. If you treat the criminals like with soft hands, they're going to continue to do criminal things. So they have to be treated as basically perpetrators of evil, and you meet force with force. If someone steals from a store, should they get a long prison sentence? Yeah, I would say yeah. I mean, especially if they're, obviously you have to take it situation by situation, but especially a lot of these repeat offenders, like we've seen some ridiculous, like that guy who murdered that woman in Charlotte, North Carolina. What was her name? Irina? She was an immigrant, by the way. I'm sure a lot of people know the story. I'm not going to, but basically there's this young woman riding on a train or a subway or whatever it was. And this random person just in front of a bunch of people just randomly stabs her in the neck repeatedly and kills her in cold blood. This happened like a month or two ago. And what's interesting about this fellow who did this is he's one of these people who just why is he even free? He had been arrested like literally dozens of times for violent crimes. And somehow he's just out and about to continue doing what he's doing, and he just murders this poor woman who was doing nothing wrong. And that story got a lot of national attention, but you see this all the time where the Democrats just people committing crimes and they get a slap on. There was actually a policy. Hold on, let me see if I can find it real fast. This is off the cuff. Hold on. Look at this. Hold on, I'm trying to. Oh yeah, here it is. Let's see if I can. Well, I don't want to. I don't want to do this off the cuff. I'd rather there's when you look at something in real time, sometimes the sources aren't as. Anyways, the point is, let's say someone stole items from multiple store multiple times, and the value of items. How many years would you want them to serve for that crime? Well, the fact that they're repeat offenders is pretty is concerning to me. So maybe at least a few months. If I was a judge, I'd say probably like 6 months would be fair for someone like that. Maybe not even a full year. And they should absolutely be forced to repay all the stolen goods would be a major part of the punishment. But I'd say for someone like that, if I was a judge and I would look at the laws of because I'm sure every state and locality has its own laws. So if somebody's stealing things, if somebody's like basically shoplifting $100, like, and they came in my court, let's say they had done this multiple times. Let's say like they've already been in front of me 3 times, and this is like the 4th time, maybe. But let's just say this is their 3rd strike. I would probably put them in jail for like 6 months, personally. I think would be a fair amount of time. Like, just kind of based on just the information that I've been given by you, I would say at least a few months would be reasonable. Yeah. So, but again, I'm not a judge, so I'm not even close to a judge. But if I was a judge, that's probably how I would go about it. Because I don't. I mean, these shoplifting is actually they know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong. So they say you can't if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. There's really nobody who walks around like just, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was doing it wrong. They know that when they're shoplifting, that they're committing a crime. There's penalties for crimes. Yeah, don't slap you. I would not slap these people on the wrist and say, oh, go get a hug from your mother and talk to your mom about it. No, if anyone comes into me, they're getting a serious punishment. This country needs to get back strong Christian values and stop the spread of liberalism. Yeah, that would actually, according to the data I'm seeing, would actually solve a lot of problems. Because if you notice, a lot of these Democrat cities where they are allowing this crime to run rampant, they're heavily secularized. So if you want to see what secularism does to crime rates, just look at what's happening. It allows crime runs rampant under these people with this ideology, and it takes a lot of Trump's electoral base is conservative Christians, and what's he doing? He get in there, and we see an immediate decrease in crime all over the country, which is good for people. So the Christian right, by electing Trump and others who allied groups, have done the right thing, and a lot of people have benefited from that. And the left is upset about it because they're losing power. The left usually doesn't care about helping people. They talk about socialism and their programs as a way to. They're not. They don't care about helping people. They care about controlling things. This has been the same since the time of Marx. Every time the left gets in power, things collapse. They turn the government, socialist government, into a grifting operation. It's no different than the corporations. It's actually worse. than the corporations running society, because the corporations can't take your money. As stupidly rich as some of these corporations are, they get all their money from people paying them directly. They can't tax you like the government can. The government can send people to your house with guns if you don't pay your taxes. So what the left does is they get in power, they raise taxes. They are just every bit as corrupt as the CEO corporations they rail against. They're just as greedy. They're just as dangerous or evil. And it never works for that reason, because you can't have these people in government without them also being corrupt. And they don't care. They don't really care about stopping crime, which is obvious from the fact that crime is so elevated in places that they run and control, as I've just demonstrated. I want to segue from the news to Christian topics. Unless if people have other questions about that, that's obviously welcome. But I want to highlight a conversation I had literally earlier today with somebody who proposes, supposedly calls himself a Christian, and I'm not going to impugn him and say he isn't, but this was a fascinating conversation that I had, and I've had this conversation before, so it's not totally surprising, but I just want to hear because I've talked about this on my channel about the KJV onlyists, and I talked about how I have had conversations with KJV onlyists where I have asked them, what would you rather have? An exact transcript of every single thing Jesus said in his entire life in the original language, or the King James Bible as it currently exists? And to my shock, a number of them have said that they would rather have the King James Bible rather than a complete transcript of everything Jesus said in his original language. Now, when I say that, a lot of people, no one really thinks that way. No one could possibly think the King James Bible is superior to an exact transcript of every single thing Jesus said in his original language. Watch this video. Watch this video. So here's me in the bottom left. And this guy in the top right has a YouTube channel called Here I Am, Lord, Send Me. Listen to this exchange. And if there's audio issues, please tell me. Okay, so let me ask you this. If you could... Oh. Hold on. How do I rewind? Oh, well. Go back and get a direct transcript of every single word Jesus said in his original language, or have the King James Bible, but you can't have both. Which would you choose?
The King James Bible.
All right, you heard it there, folks. This is I as shocking as it is, you just heard me ask him, what would you rather have? Every single word Jesus said during his life, an exact transcript of it in its original language, or the King James Bible? And you can't have both. This KJV only has said, you heard it very clearly, he would rather have the King James Bible than everything Jesus ever said. This is a shocking level of delusion and insanity that I just can't even begin to comprehend. Let's see if I can do this again. Just when I'm not making this up.
Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek in 2 seconds.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you could... All right, so here it comes again. I'm asking him, what would he rather have? Everything Jesus ever said in his original language, or the King James Bible? Could go back and get a direct transcript of every single word Jesus said in his original language, or have the King James Bible, but you can't have both. Which would you choose?
The King James Bible.
There it is. It shocks me every time. It shocks me every time. These King James onlyists are beyond delusional. I can't imagine anyone actually thinking that way, but there they are. I've had this conversation before, so I shouldn't be too surprised, but there are literally people out there who would rather have the King James Bible than every single word Jesus ever said in his original language. It's a level of delusion and insanity that it's actually concerning. It's actually dangerous to me. because it shows someone who's just so far into their delusion, there's almost no chance of reasoning with them. None. To even think that way, to even possibly think that makes sense. These people are functionally, they're what I call, have you ever heard of a functional alcoholic? These people are functionally insane, which means that they go about their lives and they probably like do a pretty good job at their job and, you know, whatever it is they're doing. But then they have these ridiculous ideas about religion and Christianity that makes me actually sympathize with atheists quite a lot. Like, hearing people say things like this is very startling and disturbing. Okay, so you would rather have the King James Bible than Jesus' actual words?
Yes.
And you can justify that in scriptures.
Yes.
Well, that's why is an English translation of what Jesus said more important than what Jesus actually said?
What do you mean? What Jesus actually said? Is Jesus eternal?
I mean, Jesus is the one who gave God's revelation. I mean, why would a translation of what he said be more better for learning about what he said than a transcript of what he actually said?
So is his word settled in heaven?
Sure. What that means?
Isn't it clear that the writers of the New Testament refer to the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures?
Yes.
Wait a minute,
Ben, I think it's what you said. The Septuagint as well shows the divine properties. So I believe the Hebrew, the Greek, and the English show that. And not only do I believe it, I can prove it. It's not like an opinion-based thing.
So I just want to confirm, because what I'm hearing is pretty startling. So if you have there's a magical genie in front of you, and he is telling you you can choose one of two options. You can either have a complete transcript of everything Jesus said in his life in his original language, or the King James Bible, but not both. You would choose the King James Bible.
Yes.
I don't even know what to say. I'm still shocked. Even though I've continually hear them say this, and I continually hear the King James onlyists, basically answer this question this way, it always blows my mind to think that a translation from the 17th century. And this just goes to show, like, we have to check, we have to investigate and analyze our own presuppositions. We have to ask ourselves, is what we believe now? I know that as a Christian, there's only so far that reason can take us. There's only so far that sense data, and observations. At some point, you get into the realm of just taking things on faith. Like Jesus says we go to heaven for obeying God's law. Okay, I can't observe God, and I can't observe people going to heaven for observing. So at some level, you just have to take things on faith. And at that point, reason and logic do break down. You're basically just saying, I believe this because it's my faith. And I admit that. But we should use reason insofar as it will take us all the way up to the point where we have to start putting our faith in these things. And when you have a position where a translation of something someone said is superior in terms of doctrine compared to Jesus' own words, then there's a long way to go for that person. I don't know if anyone is out there has any questions about Christian doctrine. Feel free to ask them. I'm just kind of, at this point, basically discussing things that I've discussed. But if there are other people out there who actually have questions about Christianity from either an internal perspective, like Christians, or if you're a skeptic of Christianity, problems you have with the faith, feel free to interact and basically ask a question or put forward a criticism. Or maybe I'll open up the room if there are people who are interested. How about I do that? It doesn't. We can talk about. I talked about Trump a little bit too. So if you have a problem with Trump, maybe you can some of those things I said about Trump. You can bring those that topic forward too, because I did kind of make the claim that for those of you who haven't watching, it looks to me like this is dirty varmint here is okay. So this is the question. Let's say someone stole items from a store multiple times. So this is for those of you who weren't watching. I went through the earlier part of the stream, all the amazing things that Trump is doing for America, and how crime is just plummeting all over the country. Just all of a sudden in 2025, crime just starts plummeting everywhere, and no one wants to give Trump credit. But is it so much of a coincidence that Trump gets elected and all this violent crime starts to plummet in cities all across the country? Obviously not. And it's obviously related to Trump's immigration enforcement as well, because a lot of the people he's supporting are violent criminals. Not all of them, certainly, but a lot of them. Enough of them that it's making a huge impact and making America much better at a very fast rate. So I said, yeah, criminals need to be punished for what they do. We can't go soft on crime. So then this arose this question. Let's say someone stole items from the store multiple times and the value of all items is under $100. How many years would you want them to serve for that crime? So I answered probably 6 months. If a person came before, if I was a judge and if someone came before me multiple times for the same shoplifting crime, like basically, let's just say around like maybe $50 to $100 worth of items. I think the third time you come in front of me, you're getting some jail time. I think 6 months is appropriate for that kind of person because you know you're committing a crime because you've been in front of me. So I know I've told you that what you're doing is wrong and you can't do it. So the fact that you keep doing it means to me you have a serious problem. And I don't have any problem giving a person like this jail time if I was a judge. Now, I'm not a judge. I'm just going to go ahead and admit that I'm not a judge. So I won't be giving anyone jail time for anything. But if I was a judge, you can absolutely guarantee that this person would be getting some jail time from me. And I think that's the way the Democrats have a soft on crime. What about for the first time? Yeah, I mean, if someone walks into a store and steals something that's less than $100, I honestly think that jail time would probably be excessive for that person. Like, probably not warranted. But if you're, yeah, so that person, I think in any case, that person must repay what was stolen, however much it was. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, there does need to be some kind of punishment for that person. That person needs to be aware that, there are consequences for doing these kinds of things and negative ones. They need to feel bad. Like, there's nothing wrong with making people feel bad for what the things that they do that are wrong. Like, that's just human psychology. We don't coddle and accommodate people's feelings who are committing criminal acts. This is the problem. This is not how you solve crime. But this is how liberals think. They think that the criminals are victims of society. So they treat them as victims. They don't treat them harshly as they deserve. They're creating suffering in this world. You have to understand there really is evil in this world. Okay, they're actually just evil people. Oh, yeah, of course, Trump is evil. No, it's the people committing crimes are simply engaging in an evil act. This is the problem with moral relativism. Oh, they're committing crimes because society is oppressive and all the money is being hoarded by the 1%. These are excuses people make to be bad. This is the victim mentality that's going to get us nowhere. Okay? It's not... Other people being rich doesn't mean you have to steal and commit crimes and potentially unalive people. These people do these things because there's evil in the human heart. And that's why Christ is the solution. Because Christ told us that the solution comes from within. But this is another problem with Christianity, is that it teaches that the Holy Spirit's the one that regenerates you. No, I'm sorry. If the Holy Spirit was the one that regenerated us, that would have already happened a long time ago, and everyone would be walking around just being a perfect little Jesus Christ clone. But that's obviously not what's happening. If the Holy Spirit's the one that regenerates us, what's he waiting for? Why doesn't he make everyone perfect? Oh, you have to let him into your heart, like the Arminians will say. Okay, so he gets into your heart. Does he override your free will? All of a sudden, you don't have autonomy as an agent? No, you're responsible for making yourself a better person. God's not going to do it for you. And this is what Christ taught. This is why Pelagius was correct. Pelagius was one of the greatest Christian philosophers of all time, and the early church crushed him and destroyed him because Augustine had a beef with him. But Pelagius was right. We control our own destiny. We can be good or bad on our own merit. We need to bring Pelagius back, and I intend to help do that to the extent that I can. But yeah, Christ essentially taught that humans are responsible for their immoral behavior. God's not going to do it for you. The Holy Spirit's not going to do it for you. You have to do it yourself. You have to be a good person on your own. That's what free will is. We are autonomous, libertarian, free will agents, moral agents. And no one's coming to save us. I mean, and by that I mean no one's coming to basically make us be good people. We have to do it ourselves. If God could end sin, as in make the world without any sinful activity, God would have already done it. Okay, I'm pretty sure about that. So the fact that God hasn't come in, regenerated every single person on earth, and made everyone a perfect clone of Jesus Christ, or whoever you think is the best person ever who ever lived, then the fact that that hasn't happened yet is proof that it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Because why would God wait? And why isn't God doing that right now? So we need to understand that we are responsible for becoming good people on our own. And there's no outside force that's going to make us do that. You're paid. Hold on one second. I got to run for about 2 seconds. And I mean 2 minutes. This is the incredible production value of the Ace Philosophy YouTube channel, just leaving the audience hanging. All right, let's see here. Mark 12:6 says Jesus murdered against God's will. That's why he was resurrected. Hi, Ace Philosophy. I'm still on vacation. I'll be back soon. We'll start my debate videos for our debate. Wow. We have been graced by, I guess this is Charles Jennings of the Layman's Seminary. All right, Charles. I think this is you. I know a lot of other people on your channel kind of operate on your channel, so I'm not sure if this is you or one of the people who I'm not sure if this is you or one of the people who also operates on your channel. Is this you, Charles, or is it someone else? I don't know if you're even still there. Ah, it's Charles. Wow. Okay. Well, I will also basically, as I prepare my debate, which I am currently doing, I will basically present the key ideas that I will be the key principles that'll be the basis of my argument. If you have any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them. But I really haven't formulated things so concrete at this point. But if you did have any questions that you were curious to know about how I go about it, maybe you could ask them now, and I can. I mean, we don't have to have the debate right now, obviously. But how about this? I will also be looking in my my community posts about a week to 2 weeks out from the debate, and I will probably be posting key verses that I'll be utilizing. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll probably be posting key verses that I intend to utilize in my debate. I probably won't be posting like a transcript of my opening statement. I'll admit that, but I will also, if you look at my debate with Praise I Am that I had a few weeks ago, I tend to use a similar line of reasoning. But instead of being the deity of Christ, it will be the obviously salvation. So basically, I will focus heavily on things that Jesus said in the Gospels, and that will be the. I won't really. I might draw some from the Old Testament, but I think a lot of my verses are going to come from the Old Testament and the gospel sayings from Jesus. And I will my basic line of argumentation will be that Jesus taught works salvation. So if you can go through and look at where you think I would interpret Jesus' teaching works salvation, and look at those verses and come up with a refutation of them, which I know you've probably done because I know you're well studied already, but that's basically going to be how I'm going to go about it. But I have yet to flesh everything out. Are you debating? Yes, I am, Dirty Varmint. I will be debating Charles on the Standing for Truth YouTube channel. Yeah, I'm glad Charles dropped in. Yep. Yep, he knows it. He knows it. He waits when you mess up. Choose it, but your will to choose him and say no to evil is always there. Think Cain and Abel. Oh, this is okay. He waits because he needs to condemn you when you messed. Oh, you're talking about the Holy Spirit. He already knows if you will choose it, but your will to choose him and say no to evil is always there. Think Cain and Abel. No, he's God. No, God is not going to wait until you do something evil to regenerate you. So God could be like, "Ha ha! I caught you. I knew you would do something evil. I was just waiting for you to." No, that's that. Why isn't if God could regenerate us? Why doesn't God just do it? He's not going to wait till you do something bad so he can just be like, "See, I told you you're going to do something bad. Now I have to come in and fix you." Every time I get cooked, it improves my flavor. Charles is quick. That's why I'm more worried about Charles than Praise I Am. Charles is quick on his feet. Maybe not literally, but figuratively. I think Charles is going to be more of a challenge than Praise I Am. Praise I Am didn't put up much of a fight. But Charles got that seminary education. He's got all that book learning he's going to be relying on. I don't think Praise I Am really has that. But yeah, I've actually kind of been more impressed with Charles recently in his more recent debates, especially his debate against Chris Lucas, which, dang, that was kind of a bloodbath for Chris Lucas. I like Chris Lucas, but dang, that was not a fair fight. So I don't want to look like that. But Chris Lucas kind of. I don't want to insult Chris Lucas. He might be in the chat, so sometimes I'm not sure if he's there or not. Usually he says he is, but I mean, Chris Lucas did. Maybe I should say this. Chris Lucas made some good points, but as far as the optics of the debate, he probably could have come more prepared. I will say that. But Charles, I think I'm having like a little more respect for Charles because he actually is demonstrating a larger breadth of knowledge about Bible hermeneutics and stuff that I didn't see from him at the beginning. I guess his professors are having that impact, so he kind of is able to employ some of this scholarly language. in a way that, your typical amateur probably can't. So it should be interesting. It should be, if I can navigate that. Time is a concept created by humans as a way to measure motion. He created time. It's non-effective. Yeah, I don't think. I agree with Dirty Varmint here. Yeah, time is just time isn't like a thing in itself. It's just the perception we have of things in motion over, from one moment to the next. Jesus is human and God. We can loop this all day. Come on, Null. Art, I just had a whole debate about that. You can't be a human and God. These are something I brought up during the debate, that those are two mutually exclusive concepts. This is why the hypostatic union is nonsensical, because it tries to say that Jesus has simultaneously two logically exclusive natures simultaneously, which is logically impossible. But it's necessary for the deity of Christ to be true. So you got to pick one or the other. Which one's it going to be? Because the Bible clearly says that Jesus is a man. All right. So, but you can only pick one. So, which one are you going to go with? All right. Yeah, if there's anyone out there right now, I'm kind of just reading the chat. If anyone has any questions about Christian doctrine, first time Charles has been in my chat. Um, so, all right, let's take a look here. God controls logic. What does that mean? Yeah. Again, if people, I did pin the link. So if someone wants to join and ask questions about Christianity or talk about this or that topic, that's fine. Or you can just participate from the chat. But otherwise, I probably will shut down the stream pretty soon here. But I am kind of happy with the engagement that I've gotten so far. And you don't have to be a Christian. If you're an atheist too, and if you want to ask a question about some aspect of Christianity, then I'm willing to take that kind of those kind of questions as well. But I just opened this up because, like I said, I was in a chat earlier. Oh, only available in side chat. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not specifically talking to anybody. I'm just talking about anyone who might be watching. How about this? Yeah, since it looks like things are winding down, I want to encourage everyone to like and subscribe, because I do like to put these excuse me, I like to put these opportunities out there for people to interact with me, for people who have interacted with me in other channels and other sittings, for them to have the chance to come and kind of speak to me in a more direct manner. Because sometimes when you're in chat rooms, it's kind of hard to focus and a lot of people are trying to chat. So let's kind of interact with this. God controls logic. So can God change the rules of logic? The kingdom of God is like a man who scatters seed on the ground. Night and day he sleeps and wakes, and the seed sprouts and grows, though he knows not how. All by itself the earth produces a crop. I believe God is inside space and time when he incarnated. So did he stop? So God was outside of time, and then he came inside space and time when he incarnated, and then I don't really understand how this view works. So let me ask you this. So your perspective is that first, before Jesus, the incarnation of Jesus, God was outside of time. And then during the incarnation, God is inside space and time. And then when Jesus died, did he go back outside space and time? Like, how does this work for you? I'm just kind of curious if you care to answer. So God isn't controlling logic. The earth produces crop all by itself. God doesn't need to actively manipulate anything. He already created the universe. Yeah, I think I agree with that. I would agree with that. Yeah, the laws of logic operate. They were created. They were basically created basically eternally. They've always operated the same way. It's not like God can, well, say, nah, I don't know what your particular perspective is. I think I remember that you are, well, obviously you're a Christian of some sort. But to me, it doesn't really make sense to say God is outside of time. And I guess it kind of depends on how you define God. Because if God is outside of space and time, that means that there is something that is outside of God. And in my opinion, God is a being who encompasses and includes. Okay, let me see here. Joker M6. No, it does not. So it does not mean. So if God is outside of space and time, it does not mean that there is something that is outside of God. Is that what you're trying to say, Joker M6? Yeah, to say God is outside of space and time is I don't think it makes sense. I really don't. So here's my question. How can God be outside of space and time without space and time being outside of God? Okay, God is almighty and all-knowing. All right, I'll agree with that. Space and time are man-made construct. Well, we perceive them as concepts in our mind, but space and time really exist outside of ourselves. Okay? I mean, obviously there are there's like the Hindus who say that all of reality is just an illusion or whatever. I guess you call them idealists, but for practical purposes, space at least, or the matter or the things that exist in space are not man-made constructs. They are things that are outside of ourselves that have objective existence. Well, here's the thing. Because you're comparing God with the physical world. Well, not really. I mean, the statement holds logically. Physical world, space-time is different for everything living. Well, I think it just goes to the logical definitions. Okay, so everything vibrates. Okay. Yeah, everything vibrates. But you can't get around that if God is outside of space and time, then I think saying logically necessarily it follows that every space and time are outside of God. I just don't understand how you can say if God is outside of time, therefore there is somebody else than God. Well, that's not exactly what I said. What I said was, if God is outside of space and time, that means that there are aspects of reality that exist outside of God, because God can't be outside them without them being outside of God. I just think that just follows logically. So for there to not be something that is encompassed by the being of God means that God is incomplete. The concept of God needs to encompass everything that exists. All right. So again, I don't think of God as like a man, like up in the clouds. Like God is the one thing that, the God of the philosophers, God is the ultimate grounding of all being. Okay. So there can't be something that exists outside and apart from God. But when you say God is outside of space and time, what you're logically saying, in my opinion, and I know you're saying from our own understanding, well, what other understanding is there? Yeah, you're basically saying everything exists inside God. Exactly. Everything that exists is encompassed by the being of God. There's nothing that's outside of God. Like now says, yeah, but you can't violate the you can't make a statement and it have no logical meaning behind it. If God is outside of space and time, then you can't just say, well, space and time is still inside God. No, God is outside of space and time. You can't have God violating the laws of logic. We are 3D beings, but there is more level. It doesn't matter. The statement God is outside of space and time precludes the possibility that space and time are inside God. But then you were saying evil exists inside God, which is not true. Well, evil isn't something that exists as like, it's not like a real thing. Evil again is kind of like time. It's kind of like a description of what we're seeing happen. So humans, their subsistence and their being is contained within the being of God, but they have their own autonomy within that. That's your logic. Well, what other logic is there? There's not like, no, it's not my logic. It's just logic. If God is limited, if there is a world and God or creation of God or God is based on you're saying God is limited. God's being is infinite. Right. Okay, I agree with that. I don't think I'm disagreeing with notes from the path. I think he might be agreeing with me. But if you are saying that God exists outside of space and time, you're saying there's a limitation from God, which is that there's God and then there's something outside of God. So God must necessarily have some sort of limit. Excuse me. Joker, you have to realize that you can't just, for us to have a meaningful conversation, there has to be definitions. The words we're using actually have to have some sort of meaning. So you can't just say something applies to God and then someone derive a logical conclusion from that and say, well, then you can't say, well, that's just your human understanding. It's like, okay, yeah. But our human understanding is based on our observation of how God's universe operates. Okay, God created the world a certain way. An example I always give is like, okay, God created elephants gray. Could God have created pink elephants? Sure. But God didn't do that. God made them gray. I mean, God probably could have made the speed of light twice what it is. But God didn't do that. God made the speed of light what it is. So we observe reality around us, and we basically come to an understanding of how the world operates. And our language is derived from all those observations. So you can't just say, like, there are things that apply logically, but not to God. Another example I always give is that, God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. No, I don't believe in the flat earth. Nothing I've said indicates that there's a flat earth. What I'm trying to say is that if you make a statement, there are necessary logical implications and consequences of that. And you don't just get to circumvent that by saying, well, God is different from God. God's being allows him to transcend all logical limitations. No. If you say that God exists outside of space and time, then there's no way to avoid the conclusion that space and time exist outside of God. There's no way to avoid that logical conclusion. Notes from the path, God is immanent and transcendent. Time is perhaps what eternity looks like refracted through a human brain. Space is perhaps what infinity looks like refracted through a human mind. Yeah, I'm starting to agree with Grant Knott. The more you try to explain God, the more chance of a head explosion. The problem is we're trying to explain a theoretical understanding of God, but when people make certain claims about God and then try to avoid the logical conclusions by saying, well, logic just doesn't apply to God, well, then we can't have a conversation because your words are meaningless. God can make 2 + 2 = 5 when the value of 5 is 4 because they know. Yeah, the concept of 5 is, but what I'm trying to say, obviously, is that God can't take 2 objects, put another 2 objects together and make it 5 objects. So 2 + 2 will never equal 5 in this reality or any other reality. It's logically impossible. It will never, 2 objects plus 2 other objects will never yield 5 objects. So you can never say 2 + 2 = 5, ever, under any circumstances. Now, you can say God can change the name of 4 to 5. Okay, well, you've just changed the label that humans have given it, but the concept can never be violated. God is not one being among many. He is being itself, the ground of being. That is, yeah, I agree with that. That is absolutely correct. That's why you can't have anything that's outside of God, because God is the being that encompasses all reality. And God is all reality. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord one day is, I understand that, but this is kind of symbolically saying that they aren't literally, one day is not literally 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is not literally one. It's basically saying that God is so ancient and eternal that 1,000 years to God is basically, to us, it's like one day. But God is also so aware of everything that's going on that within one day, God can experience everything that most people would experience in 1,000 years. So that's kind of how I understand that verse. Could it be that some people just want God to be super powerful beyond? Well, Dirty, I'm gonna push back a little bit. I mean, if there are I think that any concept of Almighty God has to have some inherent necessities, and if God lacks certain qualities or characteristics, then we have a real problem, because, like, let's say God lacks omniscience, which I don't think you believe God has omniscience. I mean, that means that what you're saying at that point is that there are things that God doesn't know. So there are aspects of reality which are foreign to God's understanding, even though God created all of reality. So, kind of thinking along those lines, I think introduces a lot of theological problems. We have to, I think God has to be omnipotent, which means that God can do all things that are logically possible. And God is the grounding of reality, which is the basis for logical deductions. God has to be all-knowing insofar as things can be known. So, can God know the future? I don't know. But if it can be known, then God does know it. You see what I'm saying? The Trinity is one. Yeah, I'm not a Trinitarian. Yeah, I'm a Christian. I am. You're not understanding it. God did not create the world in 6 human days. That's the point. Jeremiah 7:31. Nor did it ever enter my mind, meaning he had never imagined it. What exactly is that in reference to, Dirty? Isn't that in reference to? Hold on, let me go look at that real fast. Jeremiah 7:31. For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house which is called by name to defile it. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. Yeah, okay. I think that I think what God's saying here is it's just basically not something that God had in mind to command them. I guess you're using this as a verse to say that God didn't know something was going to happen. I'm a Trinitarian, just like all the great philosophers of Greece. So wait, when you say philosopher, like was Aristotle a Trinitarian? You said God does not know what is to come because is not outside. Yeah, well, yeah. I don't think God knows what's going to happen in the future as far as human actions are concerned because we have free will. Yeah, God can prophesy because God can predict with great accuracy what's going to happen, but you don't see God saying that, you don't say when these prophecies, you see these prophecies, like you see them giving in terms and generalities, okay? So I think the specifics are still worked out, but God can predict. The way I look at it is this. Let's say, like, I know, like someone I know has a dog, right? And I've observed this dog many times. When people walk through the door, the dog is going to bark and ask for a treat. Okay. So this happens when I walk to that person's house. When I go in the door, that dog is going to bark at me, essentially. Not aggressively, but like playfully. All right. So I can predict, I can prophesy essentially that because I know this dog well enough, the next time I go over to that person's house and see that dog is going to bark at me just like it has every single other time. So I believe God knows the souls of people so well that God can predict just like that. Like I'm not comparing humans to dogs necessarily, but what I am to say in likewise manner, I think that God knows people so well that he knows what we're going to do so well that God can prophesy things basically perfectly without having ontological knowledge that those things are absolutely going to happen exactly as they do. How long have I been religious? Oh, well, a pretty long time, probably at least 10 years. So there is a concept in Christianity called open theism. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's not like totally unheard of to think that God It's a philosophical problem about what God's potential knowledge is. Like, if humans have free will, then how does God know what we're going to do? You know what I'm saying? So you're operating from a perspective that says that God is like outside of time and he can like see like the universe like a movie, and if he wants to know what's going to happen, he kind of like looks to the future part of the universe, and then he comes back to where we are and kind of prophesies things. That's not how I view everything as existing right now, and the future is undeterminate. Okay, I think that makes a lot more sense. But God can see all the potential futures. I've explained this before. And so God can see all of our potential choices and how our choices are going to potentially affect the future. And God can basically predict based on what he knows about our hearts and what we're going to do. But yeah, God can't know the future with 100% certainty. Yeah, there are a lot of verses like this. It's not, I mean, let me show you something, Joker. Let me show you something. I mean, I'm not. Yeah, open theism is better than hard determinism. It's there are problems that you have to give up. You have to give up God being basically knowing the future perfectly. Okay, but oh, where is it? Ah, here it is. I'm gonna share my screen. And a dirty varmint also highlighted one of these verses. So let's look at this. This is Genesis chapter 22, verse 9. All right, Joker. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, I know Dirty Varmint doesn't like these verses and thinks it's a corruption, but I'm going to run with it for now. What I'm trying to show you, Joker, is that God apparently did not know what Abraham was going to do until he actually did it. And he actually just says right here, for now I know. There it is right there. For now I know that you fear God. It's applying that perhaps God didn't know what was going to happen before Abraham raised his hand to strike down his son. So there are verses like that in the Bible which clearly show God learning things as it relates to what people are doing and God reacting to them. I mean, the repentance of the Ninevites is another perfect example of God saying, okay, you can do this or you can do that. And depending on what you do, I'm going to, change what I'm going to do. Before Abraham was, I am. So what does that mean to you? Do you think that means Jesus is claiming to be God? What does that verse represent to you? What is the significance of that verse to you? All right. I can predict I'm going to the grocery store tomorrow, and God can make predictions and has the power. Yeah, exactly. Open theism makes a lot of sense. Jeremiah 3:19, I thought you would call me father, but I was wrong. Yeah. God knows the end from the beginning. It says God declares the end from the beginning. I'm not sure if that's the same thing. All All right, let's go to that verse. Let's go to that verse, because this is an important verse that Trinitarians bring up quite often. John 8:58. I dealt with this verse during my debate with Praise I Am, by the way. Am I a Mormon? No. I'm a Christian. Like, I'm actually a Christian. Like, a Mormon, the Mormons follow Joseph Smith. I follow Jesus Christ. So we see right here, John 8:58. So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old." What kind of Christian? Like, I'm a Christian. Like, I believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah sent by God to teach mankind the truth of salvation. What church? I no, the Protestants and the Catholics are corrupted versions of Christianity. This is what my channel is about. I'm trying to help people understand. No, Orthodox, it's all corrupted. Everything after Catholicism is corrupted. Everything after Catholicism is corrupted. This is something I've said many times on my channel. So Christianity is based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. No, there's a branch of Christianity called Jesuism. No, I'm not Orthodox. My beliefs about Christianity are all based on the teachings of Jesus Christ and what he taught, and like logically deriving things from them. So I don't have it in. I basically here's another thing about Joker. I don't really affirm the entire canon of the New Testament. So I just go by the Synoptic Gospels. So there's no, where do I find what teachings? Isaiah 9:6 says Messiah is the mighty God. Well, he says the mighty Elohim. Elohim God is an English translation of the word Elohim, but Elohim, or I guess El. So I've done this words, basically, Joker, my argumentation on this channel has always been that Christians should only derive their doctrine as far as like, well, you can look at philosophically other ideas outside of the Bible and what Jesus taught, but if you're going to be a Christian, your ideas should align with what Jesus Christ taught. So what Bible are basically, Joker, the teachings of Christ are supreme authority. So the Gospels would be the supreme source of Christian doctrine. So I do get, but Jesus taught different things in different books of the Bible. Like what? By the way, I'll just close this out. Here, Jesus is talking about his pre-existence. So I do believe Jesus had a pre-existence. I don't think Jesus is claiming to be God here. We can talk about that if you want, but Jesus taught different things in different books of the Bible. Like what exactly? This is interesting. So are you saying Jesus contradicted himself depending on where you look? So every Bible is different. Yeah, that's true, but there are differences in how they're translated, of course, but it doesn't change like the meaning, the ultimate meaning of what Jesus taught. You have to point to a specific example of where you think that took place. We could say that there are interpolations, like the long ending of Mark, but okay, yeah, that's fine. But for the most part, we should base our teachings on our doctrine of what Jesus taught, insofar as we can know what they actually were. So yeah, I get my doctrine from the Gospels as they are currently recorded. Why do you reject the book of John? There are some scholars that truly believe John was the first. The idea that John was written first is absolutely a fringe viewpoint. I don't know almost any scholars who think John was written first, and there are a lot of problems with that view. One is that we see John start getting quoted much later than the other Gospels, or not much later, but it doesn't really seem to come into prominence until Irenaeus, and we see Justin Martyr quoting the Synoptics at length before that, and also other early Christian documents like the Didache seem to contain large portions of the Synoptic Gospels in them, whereas a lot of the John material seems to come a little bit later. Well, if you only read the American Bible, King James, you are not. I never said I never, ever. I actually, you probably missed the part of this stream where I said King James onlyists are delusional, and they're dangerously delusional. He did not name the first being as Adam. Adam means human. Okay. If you really want to know the Bible, learn Hebrew. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that, but we don't have anything that Jesus said written in Hebrew, unfortunately. I mean, apparently there was a Gospel of Matthew that was written in Hebrew, but it's been lost to time, unfortunately. So if you want to know what Jesus taught, you have to study Greek. But Jesus didn't speak Greek, so I will agree with you that we kind of don't know exactly what Jesus said. So the best we have is a Greek translation of what Jesus said, which can work. But obviously, these people who rely on like grammatical analyses of the Greek text to prove, I don't do that. Like I kind of do, but at the same time, I recognize that there are limitations to that. Namely, I don't actually know if this is a translation of what Jesus said is actually exactly what he said. So that is a little bit of a problem who want to say who want to base everything they believe on an analysis of the Greek language. To me, it's kind of it's unfound, it's unstable, because basically we know Jesus didn't speak Greek, which is a problem because the entire New Testament is recorded in Greek. But I think it's still reliable enough that we can, just because it's a translation of what Jesus said doesn't mean we can't learn about what he said and what he taught. It just means we can't know exactly what he said. But that's not entirely necessary. It's only necessary if you want to iron out some details about things that I think are secondary. But we can kind of know, we can understand what he taught about salvation, which is the most important thing. We can know the basic principles that he taught based on the record that we have, I believe. Oh shoot, I missed a whole lot of. Read the Bible in English. We are missing everything. We're not missing everything. We don't. I always put it this way: there might be some things that are lost in translation. We can't know that what we're reading is exactly thought for thought what Jesus was teaching. Johannine priority is a real position that scholars take. No, that is a fringe view. I don't know how many scholars believe John was written first, but I guarantee it was less than 10%. Yeah, Mark was definitely the first. There are a lot of reasons to believe Mark was the first gospel written. A lot of reasons. Jesus or Isus, what does that even mean? Well, Jesus is a Greek transliteration of Yeshua. So Jesus' real name was Yeshua, which means Joshua. So Joshua, yeah, okay. Yeshua literally means God salvation, right? Yeshua is his real name. Yeah, you're right about that. Yeshua is Jesus' real name. Yeah, I don't dispute that. Jesus himself taught against Johannine priority, established every word by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Since John is not, yeah, the problem with John is it doesn't have anything attesting to it outside of itself. Whereas I like the synoptics because I think they do come from multiple sources, vantage points, and they kind of confirm each other. So I like that. That's why I kind of really prefer the synoptics as far as developing and establishing my own doctrine and understanding of Christ's teachings. Why do you say Jesus didn't speak Greek? It's highly likely he did speak Greek. Well, he probably did speak some Greek, but I don't think he was teaching and conversing in Greek. So let's put it that way. Like, I don't think Jesus gave the Sermon of the Mount in Greek. The Sermon on the Mount. Like, he's not going around telling people that he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel while teaching Greek. It just doesn't make sense. Jesus was probably teaching in Aramaic or Hebrew, and there's a lot of historical reasons to think that originally that it was recorded in those languages, but because most of the copies were in Greek, because most people were Greek speaking, that's just what has been handed down to us. I think it's okay. Yeah, it's a minority view, not a fringe view. I think that there are personally. I don't think it makes sense. There are so many reasons to reject Johannine priority that I can't even get into them all. The earliest was more like the Q source of Gospel Thomas. Mark wasn't until 70 AD. Well, we really don't know when Mark was written, but I do believe there's a lot. Like I said, to me, it's the historical evidence seems to point very strongly that Mark was written, then Matthew, then Luke, then John, in that order. I've talked about the synoptic problem on my channel. How Mark wrote Mark. Okay. Matthew wrote Matthew originally in Hebrew. I think Matthew was probably familiar with Mark and then thus appended his own. I think actually Matthew did copy from Mark. But he added his own ideas. So Matthew is essentially Mark plus Matthew. Luke came along later, saw Mark and Matthew, that source, plus had other sources. So he included them in his gospel. And then John, well, I did say John, the author of Gospel John clearly knows about Mark and Matthew. There's just no way around it. So to me, that's kind of problematic. I don't think there's actually, I think the synoptic problem is the idea. I think the reason they can't find the Q source is because there is no Q source. I just think Mark wrote the first gospel and then Matthew knew what Mark had written and used it as a template and also added his own ideas. And then Luke, later on, while compiling his evidence for Christianity, which he says he does in the opening, verses, uses Mark and Matthew, but also has other sources and uses them as well, which is why there's material in Luke that isn't in Mark or Matthew. Makes complete sense. No, John wrote without knowledge of the synoptics. Come on, say no. I mean, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that John's gospel is going to follow pretty much the same narrative in some places as the without having knowledge of them, as Mark and Matthew. Gospel of Thomas proves there is a Q source. It's just the sayings of Jesus was the earliest form of the Gospels. I don't know if it proves that. It proves that there were people who were just looking at the sayings of Jesus without all the narrative elements. We can't really date the Gospel of Thomas. I don't think the Gospel of Thomas proves there was a Q source. I think it just proves that some early Christians extracted sayings that Jesus had, and they could have taken them from the Gospels themselves. Kind of like Thomas Jefferson had the Jefferson Bible, where all he did was basically extract statements from Jesus and put them in a Bible in various languages. The Gospel of Thomas could be a very early version of the Jefferson Gospel or the Jefferson Bible. You know? Each iteration of the Gospel added more stuff. The original Gospels had no passion narrative, no death, burial, or resurrection. Well, we don't know that. The manuscripts we have could be corrupted in the sense that those portions were lost. Like if you go to the Gospel of Mark, like if you just go to the ending of Mark, go to the end. Wait, where are we? Yeah, this is Mark 16. So we know that at the end of Mark, it goes basically verses 1 to 8. And then 9 through 20 are considered questionable, put it that way. But here's the ending without the other verses. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you. There you will see him, just as he told you." They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then it ends. Okay, so apparently it just ends there, according to Mark. Notice we do already have the resurrection here. We have the death, we have the burial, we have the resurrection. What we don't have are the appearances to the disciples that came thereafter. Okay? So we do have Jesus being crucified. We have Jesus being buried. We have Jesus as basically not being in the tomb, which means he has resurrected or being taken. But it does end somewhat abruptly. So my opinion is that there is an actual additional material to this, but we don't know what it is. And the endings we have now for Mark are not the actual ending. So I think what probably happened is that someone deleted the original version and created this new version, which we have in the King James version. And it begins in verse 9 and goes to verse 20. So everything from verse 9 to verse 20 is a later addition that was added by some scribe or some early Christian who didn't like the original ending. But unfortunately, because of the actions of these early Christians, we'll never know how it actually ended. But we can pretty much be certain that it didn't end the way it's given in the King James Bible, because it's a bunch of gobbledygook. Like if we go to the King James, this is a New American. If we go to the King James version, it goes right from 8 to 9. And then it says, now Jesus was risen early in the first day of the week. He appeared first. And so this is how it goes on. And you start getting these appearances. Go ye. So this is one problem I have. So right here in verse 16, and he said to them, "Go ye into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." That just strikes me as something that like an early Catholic put in there after the idea of people need to be baptized to be saved. So this is probably these verses were probably added like literally hundreds of years after Jesus Christ died. That's how long they were manipulating these texts. I mean, read this. And these signs shall follow them. In my name shall they cast out devils, shall they speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents. If they drink anything deadly, it shall not hurt them. I mean, come on, folks. This is, I mean, it's saying if you drink deadly poisons, you won't get sick. This is not something that was in the original text. It just isn't. This is after the idea of baptismal salvation had been developed. So we're talking literally probably in the 3rd century. And the reason we know that is because the earliest manuscripts don't have this ending. And the earliest manuscripts are dated to, you guessed it, the 3rd century. So this ending from the King James Version was probably added 300 or 400 years after Jesus Christ. After the Catholic Church created the notion that you need to be baptized to be saved. And that's why this is in here. This is not something that Jesus said. This is something an early Catholic threw in there because they wanted you to have to get baptized to be saved. And it doesn't make sense. You being put in water doesn't save you. It doesn't make you righteous. It doesn't make you a good person. There are a lot of baptized people who are evil. Jesus taught you how to be righteous. This is so clear what happened. That doesn't mean that it just means that in this particular gospel, in this particular manuscript that the King James Version used. But this is why the newer versions don't use this. Eastern Thomas is with us. What do you got, Eastern Thomas?
How's it going? I saw you're discussing Christian doctrine, and you know I'm a Christian, so
yeah. So yeah, I was talking about how I believe, and obviously you're going to disagree with me.
Yep.
I believe that the Catholic Church created the idea of baptismal regeneration, and this happened early in Christianity, and they added these verses to the end of Mark to validate their created doctrine. So obviously you're going to disagree with that, but feel free to argue against it if you want.
Well, I mean, I think that, baptismal regeneration is very clear in Scripture. I think both in the Old Testament and the New. I mean, you've got, Ezekiel, the verses in Ezekiel, which, I think were historically and patristically viewed as, kind of foreshadowing or predicting baptism, which say things like, "Oh, I saved you by sprinkling you with water," and verses of that nature. But then you get to the New Testament and you get to verses like John 3:5. I know that's a little bit debated. Some people will say, "Oh, no, that's about material birth." But that's another verse that was, patristically understood to be, a baptismal regeneration verse. And then, I don't know if you consider these verses to be, scriptural or not, but, the first letter of St. Peter, in the first letter of St. Peter, you've got baptism now saves you. And, in verses or if you go even with St. Paul, I mean, St. Paul, you've got in, the letter to the Romans, he says, when we were baptized, we were buried with him. In Galatians, he says, every one of you who is baptized has put on Christ. In the letter to the Colossians, he's kind of comparing the deadness of the old law to the merits of the new law. and he views the sacrament of baptism as kind of being this means that sort of replaces circumcision, and he sort of portrays it in a light to where circumcision was completely irrelevant in begetting grace, but he compares it against baptism as if this is something that is the opposite of that does have the ability to beget grace. So I think water baptism and the idea of baptismal regeneration, I think that's something that is explicitly clear both in the Old and New Testament. I mean, even if you want to get rid of that verse in Mark, which I know that's a debated verse. I know needgod.net oftentimes will say, "Oh, that's not a true verse." But even if you want to make the argument that verse is incorrect, I mean, there's a lot of catching up you need to do with all these other verses, which have historically been viewed as baptismal regeneration verses.
Let me ask you this: what was Saint Thomas Aquinas' view on baptism? Did he view it as regenerative or not? I'm genuine. I'm genuinely
Yes,
asking.
he absolutely viewed it as regenerative. The way St. Thomas Aquinas views all of the seven sacraments is he views the seven sacraments in the manner where they're not absolutely necessary to be saved. So if A's believes and A's has been communicated the virtue of charity through the pouring of God's love into his heart, and he doesn't have the ability to get baptized, God isn't going to hold that against him. However, God still prescribes the sacraments as generally necessary. He compares it. The reason God does this, St. Thomas makes the analogy of a doctor who prescribes medicine based on the nature of the person's illness. And so St. Thomas basically makes the argument that, okay, God has, God can see what our nature is. Now, he takes kind of a non-Pelagian synergistic approach to this. A monergist would not agree with this approach. But St. Thomas's model basically says, God sees, the state of man's sin, and he basically prescribes sacraments that beget grace based on the condition of a man's sin and what he thinks is best to treat the condition of a man's sin. And so when it comes to baptism, the idea of baptism is it's supposed to communicate Christ's passion to the person and Christ's grace to the person through washing. In the same manner as you would think of water as washing you from dirt. In that same manner, St. Thomas would say, okay, God prescribes baptism to kind of communicate God's grace in sort of an analogical sense of, in the same way his passions wash us from sin. That's done in the same manner as, say, a person who would wash a person with water of dirt. Or when it comes to the Eucharist, St. Thomas would say that has kind of a double meaning because, A, he argues that the Eucharist literally is Christ's body. But he says in that same manner, it also provides union with Christ, and it all ultimately signifies physical union with Christ. So when you take the Eucharist, that begets grace in the sense that that's literally Christ. But by taking that, you are uniting with Christ, and by every single person, taking communion in that church, ultimately everyone is coming together and everyone is united by the presence of Christ in the accidents of bread and wine, kind of signifying the body of Christ, kind of signifying Christ's words, which are, every one person, where there are 2 or 3 people, I will be there, kind of signifying the idea of everyone who is a part of the church being unified into the Godhead. So that's kind of how he views the sacraments, including baptism, is that they are not absolutely necessary, but they do beget grace, and they are generally necessary because they are most befitting to man's nature based on the illness of sin and the consequence of sin on a person's nature.
Yeah, we could talk about all the sacraments endlessly, but I do want to focus on baptism. Let me ask you this. So my understanding is that the Catholic Church teaches infant baptism, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And when a person is baptized, now correct me if I'm
Mhm.
wrong, that person is, for that moment, essentially cleansed of sin and saved, and they must basically not commit mortal sins from that moment to maintain their salvation. Is that kind of
So,
the
so,
understanding?
so the Catholic view is that a person is justified when they are baptized. So the idea is, Saint Thomas, when he talks about faith, he views faith as assenting to a claim through a given action. And so Saint Thomas would say, when a person has faith, they assent to the claims that have been presented to them by ultimately receiving either a baptism of water, a baptism of desire, like the thief on the cross did, or a baptism of blood, like many of the Christian martyrs in other countries who are unable to be baptized with water received. And then from that point, they are officially justified. St. Thomas views justification as the first moment wherein God pours his favor onto a person. He kind of views it as think of a person who's cold and they turn on the heat. And for the first moment, there's this process of heating into their body. He says, in the same like manner, justification is the beginning of the process of a person being moved to justice. Sanctification is when a person goes through recovery from sin. So think of, okay, you get into a car accident, your life is in danger because you've been seriously injured. A doctor resuscitates you, so now you're back to life. You've been stopped from dying. That's justification in St. Thomas's analogy. But then, because you're seriously injured, you have to go through a recovery process. That's sanctification. And so a person can lose their salvation through mortal sin, but only through the but that's during the sanctification process.
All right, let me ask you. I just want to get your take on this. So this is First Corinthians chapter 1,
Mhm.
starting in verse 11. This is the Paul writing. Obviously, you're aware of that. For I have been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people, that there are quarrels among you. Now I mean this, that each one of you is saying, I am Paul, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. Has Christ been divided? Paul was not crucified for you, was he? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that none of you were baptized in my name. So, and then it says here, let's skip down a little bit, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but preach the gospel. So, this is a very strange thing for Paul to say. If baptism is the initiation of the justification process, shouldn't Paul be baptizing people?
Well, no. Saint Thomas would say the wisdom of God's providence is ultimately that it's done according to a specific order, and that the higher powers ultimately move the lower powers to a specific point. And so, what he would say is, not everyone is called to be a minister of the church, but again, because ultimately the peace of God's providence comes through his order. It is befitting that those who are not ministers not be given the charism of baptism. That's why St. Paul also says, many of you have been given different gifts. Some were given the gift of tongues, some were given the gift of prophecy. St. Thomas kind of interprets that to mean that God gives different charisms to a person based on the order of his providence. So what he would say in regards to that verse is St. Paul is not saying baptism is a bad thing, but rather that his ministry did not lead him to baptism, or the dignity of his mission did not lead him to baptism. So that's how I would interpret the later verse. Now, you brought up another verse where he says, I'm glad I didn't baptize you. The reason he's saying that right there is because they were ultimately starting rumors, or the Corinthians were starting rumors and gossip to try and divide each other. They were trying to stir up drama, saying that St. Peter had this animosity against St. Paul, and St. Paul had this animosity against St. Peter. And so the Corinthians were trying to use this gossip to divide people and get into different types of camps. What St. Paul is saying here is he's afraid that if he was the one to baptize them, then that would ultimately rile them up, and ultimately give them more justification to divide each other and get into certain camps and get into a pro-Paul camp or an anti-Paul camp or a pro-Peter camp or an anti-Peter camp. Because if he baptized certain Corinthians that were trying to take sides against St. Peter, then they would have used their baptism from St. Paul to try and create almost this cult-like mentality around him. And that's not what he wanted, which is why he's saying, heaven forbid, thank goodness I was not the one who baptized you, because then you would have reacted in that manner.
Yeah, it isn't part of, maybe I'm wrong, isn't part of the Catholic doctrine is that once you're baptized, you receive the gift of the Holy Spirit?
Yes, that is, well, once you're baptized, a person receives the love of the Holy Spirit poured into their hearts.
So I guess my question would be, if these people have the Holy Spirit, wouldn't that prevent them from basically being divisive within the body of Christ? So
Well,
baptizing them would
no.
have.
Well, no, because in the initial moment where they're justified, there's the initial moment where they're justified, but then again, there's also sanctification, and sanctification is the ongoing recovery process. This is what St. Paul refers to as the indwelling of the Spirit, wherein the person's body becomes in many ways like a temple for the Holy Spirit. And this is one of the things he writes about later in the first letter to the Church of Corinth, when he's condemning certain sins that are contrary to the virtues of God. And here what he says is, he says, okay, you received this gift in the past. He'll constantly say, when you believed, when you were justified, when when the Spirit entered into you. But then he goes on to say, but these are these sins that will keep you from heaven. No idolater, no enslaver, no adulterer will enter the kingdom of heaven. So there he's saying, okay, you received this favor from the Spirit, but now you have to live in a manner to where the Spirit ultimately becomes a temple for you, or a dwelling place towards you. That's the indwelling of the Spirit. And that's where a person can lose their salvation. That's where a person can ultimately commit a sin that is contrary to charity. And again, charity is how the love of the Spirit is poured into our hearts. And so if a person commits a sin against charity, that's ultimately contrary to the Spirit. That would ultimately be blasphemy against the Spirit. And that would ultimately cut a person off from grace, which is one of the things he talks about in the letter to the Galatians.
Let me ask you this. Before you answer, there's actually kind of like more than one question. So who is qualified to conduct a baptism? Now, before you answer, if I'm like evangelizing next to a fountain and I talk to somebody and convert them, even though I'm not a priest or ordained within the Catholic order, could I just like baptize them in the fountain and save their soul, or are there certain people who are commissioned to do this and no one else can do it?
No,
According to the
it would have to be someone who is a minister of Christ, because the dignity of their office ultimately, because that's the dignity of their office ultimately proceeds from the fact that they have received the gift of prophecy from the laying down of hands, and through that constant chain of passing down through the laying on of hands, which St. Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14. He says, you received the gift of prophecy through the laying down of hands. Through that constant laying down of hands, they've been given this prophecy, which allows them to act in the person of Christ. So that's why only a priest or only a presbyter, in the early church, they were called presbyters. Today, the Catholic Church refers to them as priests. That's why only a priest can consecrate the Eucharist. Only a priest can administer the sacrament of penance, because ultimately they've been given the gift of prophecy through the laying down of hands. That's ultimately the form and dignity of their office. Now, when it comes to baptism, because a deacon is considered because a deacon is considered a subordinate to a priest. There are some privileges that he is granted that other members of the church are not granted. Like, for example, a deacon can administer baptism to a person, even though he is not a priest. However, only a priest can administer confession. Only a priest can consecrate the Eucharist. But again, the reason is ultimately because of the form and the dignity of the office that is received through the charism, which is passed down from Christ himself through the laying down of hands from the start of the church, which we read about in the scriptures. Now, to your question, well, what about a person? Is there any situation where a person can administer sacraments even if they are not, a priest? The answer is only in extraordinary situations. So, for example, let's say you were a believer and you had a friend who was a believer and he wanted to receive a baptism, but he had a heart attack all of a sudden. He's planning to get a baptism the very next day, but he's having a heart attack right now. A's philosophy is the only one in the room, and it looks like he's about to die. If this person is dead set on receiving a baptism officially, then in that extraordinary situation, A's can step in and provide him with a baptism in that instance. However, that is not according to the typical form and the typical dignity of the office of the priesthood, which ultimately states that every the unity of the church, or the prophecy of Christ is passed down through the ministers through the laying down of hands, and also B, the idea that the unity of the church lies in the fact that someone administers the faith to the faithful in the same manner that a body part would communicate a certain function of the body to another part of a body through a person. That's kind of how the church kind of operates like a body. The certain ministers pass certain things of faith down to people in the same manner that a body part would ultimately exude a certain faculty to a person, to the rest of a person's body.
Something you brought up during all that, I just kind of curious. Let's say my friend, the guy who's having a heart attack,
Right.
he's like, he's converted. He's been convinced, not by me, but by someone else. Let's say I'm an atheist, and I'm the
Mhm.
only person in the room. Can an atheist perform the baptismal rite, or does it have to be like a
Well, no,
believer?
no, it would have to be a believer. It would have to be a believer. Because
Okay.
again, an atheist is not informed of the supreme good, which is God. Only by coming to know God as the supreme good would that atheist come to the fullness of faith.
So is that person just um, that
Well,
guy
that
who's having a
person
heart attack?
wouldn't be damned. That person wouldn't be damned because, again, there's three types of baptism. There's a baptism of desire, a baptism of blood, and a baptism of water. Again, as I said earlier, God dispenses the sacraments. He uses the sacraments to dispense grace based on the necessity of the person's nature and also the severity of the person's sin or the situation of the person's sin. If a person absolutely cannot receive a water baptism, God isn't. God will notice that. Okay, yes, I administered the sacrament for the good of this person's nature, but a person's nature right now precludes them from receiving this water baptism. So I'm not going to hold them accountable for that. And so God would ultimately reckon that grace to the person through desire. That connects to what Jesus says in Mark chapter 10 when he says, if you want to receive, if you want to be baptized, you must drink the cup of my passions. Someone who has a baptism of desire truly wants to be baptized but can't receive it. Or conversely, let's say a Muslim in a Muslim majority country comes to the truth of Christ, starts to believe in Christ. Like let's say a Muslim in Iraq comes to the truth of Christ. Ultimately, he believes, but there's no Catholic churches around him because it's Iraq, and he's about to be killed for his faith. In that case scenario, his willingness to die for his faith would be drinking from the cup of Jesus's passions. And so ultimately the charism and the grace of baptism would be communicated to him through that manner. Now, I use the example of the person dying of a heart attack because even if a person is dying of a heart attack, there's a good chance they may still want to receive that grace regardless. But ultimately, if that person doesn't receive that grace,
Yeah.
ultimately, if that person doesn't receive that baptism, that doesn't necessitate that they won't receive that grace, but they may want to just because it's the proper form, or they ultimately just have a great burning desire for it.
So here's kind of what I'm going with. What I'm seeing here is that in all of this, including through baptism, the institution of the church is necessary for a person's salvation. So to be
Well, I would agree with
justified
that.
for, yeah, what I guess, but you can see how, according to my understanding of the teachings of Christ, every person's salvation is a personal relationship with God. Whether you're saved or not is just, there's no mediator necessary. God looks at you, looks at your behavior, judges you based on that, and that's how you are justified. But when you talk about human institutions, understand that the Catholic Church derives power from people thinking that their relationship with God is mediated through them. So if people think that they can't get saved unless they're baptized by a priest, that would empower the human institution of the Catholic Church. So you can see how there's a profit motive here for the church to convince people that this institution is necessary for their salvation. You see what I'm saying here?
Well, here's the problem, though. Ultimately, it is impossible for a person to have faith without a first proposal, and the reason for that is very obvious. Because while a person can come to know God by natural reasons, there are certain things about God that are revealed that, like the existence of angels, for example, that a person would not know without some sort of antecedent. And so for that reason, there does need to be there needs to be some sort of antecedent that provides the faith to a person, or preaches the faith, or proposes the faith, and it needs to proceed from a certain source. So St. Paul talks about it in Romans 10. He says, how shall they believe who have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? So right there, he's laying the groundwork for the idea of belief being an assent to a previously proposed claim. St. Augustine writes very heavily about the idea that faith is ultimately an assent to a claim. It's not, I believe Michael Jackson is secretly alive. Well, what led you to believe Michael Jackson is secretly alive? Nothing. I just believe it. Well, that's not really true belief. True belief would be, okay, a weatherman tells you, okay, tomorrow it's going to rain in your area, and it's going to rain pretty hard, and you have a plan to go out and have a picnic that day. But ultimately, because the weatherman is saying a truth that you can't see at that moment, you're still going to assent to his claim or his proposal, and you're going to move around that. And so the reason why I would say the human institution is necessary is ultimately because if you don't have a solid ground for a first proposal of faith, then you're going to lead into what St. Thomas talks about as the infinite regression, which is basically the idea that certain divine truths are just rendered into mere human opinions based on tangible understandings of knowledge. So, for example, look at, say, the Protestant Catholic debate over the canon of Scripture. A Protestant will say there's 66 books. A Catholic will say that there's 73 books, and nobody knows who's right. I, as a Catholic, will ask the Protestant, I'll say to them, well, how do you know without the human institution that there are 66 books in the Bible? And so the Protestant will usually respond by, kind of angrily saying, well, the church didn't tell me this. The church didn't decide the canon of Scripture. God did. And I always respond to that by saying, yes, I agree with that. But how do you know that? Because there are plenty of things about God that we know now that weren't always known. The very faith in general was largely in doubt before the time of Abraham. The Trinity, whether you believe in the Trinity or not, was not officially known until it was officially later revealed by God. So what is the antecedent that ultimately leads you to believe this about Scripture? And that's where the necessity of the human institution comes in, because the human institution has received prophecy from God. They have the ability to step in and make certain proposals about the faith, which proceed from certain knowledge. And then people have the ability to ultimately ascend to those claims. And so that's why I think the human institution is necessary, especially when it comes to baptism and the sacraments. Ultimately, without the institution, the faith would not have been delivered to us in the first place.
You got Chris Lucas coming at you here. He's got a couple of comments in a row, so let's try to read through them and see how you... And the Roman Church and the modern Eastern Orthodox are not Catholic. The only people that would be considered Catholic are people like Polycarp and the early Eastern Church who observed Passover. We cannot call the modern Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic Church because they long since rebelled against apostolic teachings of people like Polycarp. I never understand how the Roman Church and modern Eastern Orthodox think they have the power to excommunicate Polycarp, who we know learned directly from the disciples and learned Passover from them. Did the Roman Catholic Church excommunicate Polycarp?
They did not excommunicate Polycarp. I think what he's
Okay,
trying
so
to say, and I don't want to put words in Chris's mouth here, but I think what he's trying to say is he's trying to argue that Saint Polycarp, well, first of all, the fact that he's a saint kind of tells you that he wasn't excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But I think what he's trying to say, and I don't want to put words in Chris's mouth, but it sounds like what he's trying to say is he believes that the Catholic Church differs from the views of Saint Polycarp, and that they basically excommunicated his ideas. That's what I think he's trying to say. Again, Chris, if that's not what you're saying, feel free to correct me in the comment section below. But that was kind of my understanding of that, which obviously I don't agree with. I think I've read a lot of the works of Saint Polycarp, and I think there's a lot of continuity, especially on things like the Eucharist and other teachings with the modern Catholic Church. And Saint Polycarp. I mean, I would say at the very least, I would say there's more continuity with, Saint Polycarp in pertainance to the Catholic Church than there is with most mainstream Protestantism.
yeah, okay. I guess he said something about Passover. What's his problem with the Catholic Church and Passover? Do they not celebrate Passover?
I have no idea. I don't know if that's supposed to be. I don't know what he's talking about there.
I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Okay, I feel like you responded to his comments as adequately as anyone can. But going back to what I was saying, when I look at this, when I look at what appears to me to be, you have to ask, somebody added these verses to the end of Mark. And clearly, one of the things they wanted to establish doctrine. So this is an early Catholic who wants to establish doctrine that you can't be saved without baptism, which obviously at that time, the baptism is being performed by the Catholic Church institution, as you said. So this is a power grab, in my opinion. So I think that, to me, it just seems to me, it's not proof, but it's evidence that the Catholic Church was trying to amass this spiritual authority that it never really had. And they're trying to usurp that from a direct relationship to God that every person on this earth has, outside of and apart from the Catholic Church. So I think that the Catholic Church, in many ways, while it does teach some truth, it ultimately does it for its own purposes and its own benefit. And I know you don't think that way, but this was the mindset of the people who you have to admit, like, there was a lot of time the Catholic Church operated in ways that can be seen as benefiting and profiting itself. This is what the whole Protestant Revolution. This is indulgences. This is what the Protestant Revolution was. And I think co-opting baptism and saying you can't be saved without baptism is a part of that. And all of the sacraments, I think it's all part of it. It's all part of the Catholic Church establishing itself as this necessary institution without which you can't be justified in the sight of God. So you don't see a problem with any of that?
Well, first of all, in regards to the Catholic position on water baptism, it is necessary that a person receive water baptism. It is not absolutely necessary. So we wouldn't say that every single person who dies without a water baptism is not saved. Obviously, we read in the scriptures that the thief on the cross was saved without a water baptism. The Catholic Church doesn't teach that. The Catholic Church has never taught that. There was actually a Catholic priest in the 20th century named Leonard Feeney, and he was actually excommunicated from the Catholic Church because he taught that if a person was not, he taught that every single person who did not receive a water baptism according to the Catholic Church went straight to hell. And that was something he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for. So the Catholic Church doesn't teach that. The Catholic Church does teach that it is generally necessary that a person receive a water baptism because it's ultimately befitting to man's nature and the nature of sin. But to respond to your other question about the Catholic Church and does the Catholic Church teach this sort of idea which sets itself up as the ultimate denominator to be benefited from. Well, I mean, to figure this out, I would just use the model that St. John Henry Newman came up with. St. John Henry Newman came up with the model of ultimately judging the Catholic Church, ultimately judging Christianity in general, based on the consistency of her teachings. One of the things that St. John says is, if Catholicism isn't true, then ultimately it's very unlikely that Christianity has a chance of being true, or that theism has a chance of being true, because, and the reason he says this is ultimately because of the infinite regression problem. If you don't have a first truth, if you don't have a first proposal, then which serves as a symbol of faith, then there is no original, rational, certain ground for a person to believe in unseen truths and to assent to those truths. And so without that, you ultimately go down this rabbit hole of, begging the question, to the point where certain rules of faith just become mere opinions. And so that's why St. John Henry Newman argues that without the Catholic Church, it is very unlikely that Christianity could be true in general. So you could make that argument that it sets up the Catholic Church as this ultimate denominator. But I would just respond, by saying, if we look at the principle of fittingness, it does not seem befitting that faith would be, accurate, or that faith would be a reasonable or rational science without there being a first proposal of truth. But also, too, I would encourage people to ultimately study the scholastic views on Catholic doctrines and ultimately weigh them against the consistency of the Christian faith. I believe that there is great consistency. I believe when you look at the scholastics, not just St. Thomas Aquinas, but also people like St. Albert the Great and Bishop Peter Lombard, I think what you see is ultimately a completely consistent narrative throughout thousands and thousands of years of faith. Wherein, in other, Christian sects and other Christian claims, you don't get that same level of consistency. And so I think it's fair to, I don't think it's wrong to have doubts and say, is this only going on because of this? But I would ultimately resolve those doubts by weighing it against the principles, the preambles of faith, which I think can't exist without the magisterium, but also B, weighing it against the principle of fittingness. Are the claims consistent with the overall narrative of Christianity? And I would say yes, they are. But I think by doing that, we can see that, okay, the Catholic Church is not just doing this to benefit for their own profit. They're doing this because this is completely consistent with the economy of salvation.
Well, there's a lot there. See, for me, the fact that the Catholic Church didn't always exist, but there were obviously humans who existed before it, who lived and died and need to have a way of being saved, shows me that there was an eternal truth that maybe was taught by the Catholic Church, but preceded it. And thus, while the Catholic Church may be seen as an aid, and I'm not saying that it is at best, but what I'm saying is at the very best, it would seem that something came along which would aid people in understanding these pre-existent truths. So,
I wouldn't dispute that.
well, you kind of are. You are, though, because what you're saying is, though, if you're going to argue that the Catholic Church is essential in any way, then you're also kind of logically committed to saying that the people who weren't part of the Catholic Church, whenever or wherever they were, can't be saved. So,
well, what I would argue is that the covenant that God started with Abraham was ultimately fulfilled with the consummation of Christ's covenant, which ultimately was completed with the establishment of the church, wherein the faith was ultimately delivered to all men, with the intention of physically grafting them into the Godhead. So, in regards to your claim about, there was a faith that existed before the Catholic Church, yes, I'd agree with that. You had the Old Covenant. The whole idea of the Old Covenant was that the Old Covenant was inseparable from the New Covenant, but it was meant to foreshadow the Old Covenant through certain signs and certain prophecies, and certain figures. Like, for example, Abraham trying to, sacrifice his son, but then ultimately being stopped by God. That was ultimately supposed to foreshadow God only sacrificing his only begotten son, or something like Melchizedek, the high priest, giving bread and wine. That's supposed to be representative of the Eucharist and the propitiation that we see during the liturgy every week, which is obviously expanded upon a little bit more in the book of Malachi, and then is later confirmed to be the case in the letter to the Hebrews. But I think all of these things were delivering the faith in a gradual manner, but they were brought to fruition through the new covenant. So I wouldn't disagree that these were all foreshadowing the new covenant, which included the consummation of God's church, wherein the faith was ultimately delivered to the rest of the world, as we read in Matthew chapter 28. But what I would ultimately argue is that when it came to the Old Covenant, there were still symbols of faith that were being delivered unto certain people, going back to the time of Abraham. They were just being delivered gradually. I mean, think about it. Without all the prophets, how would the Jews of the Old Testament have been delivered the faith? I mean, how would the Israelites have been delivered the faith if Moses had not delivered it to them? How would Abraham and
Let
his...
me answer that. I would argue that, like I said, like Moses revealing it to them obviously would help them, but they still theoretically could have like accidentally done it on their own without that revelation. Like they didn't need Moses, but it's certainly helpful that God
Well,
revealed things.
I don't agree with that, because I would say that yes, it is true that a person can know the natural law according to their own hearts. That's one of the things St. Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1. But I would push back on that a little bit, because there are some truths that are ultimately above our nature, and beyond human understanding. Like, if the Bible had never been written, would you know what an angel was? I mean, probably not. I mean, there's nothing in nature that could ultimately tell you that angels exist. Now, ultimately, the fact that there are antecedents in nature that ultimately tell us that God exists. For example, we know that every man has a natural end, and that natural end is charity. That's why when we fail to ultimately, engage in charity, we feel unsatisfied, because we act contrary to our natural end. And St. Thomas would say that supreme good is God, wherein a person obtains the active being, which is ultimately the faculties to complete their natural end. So that would be an antecedent where you could say, okay, a person knows God even if they don't have the Bible. But again, when it comes to other things like angels or demons, or whether you believe in it or not, the Trinity, these are things that you would never even know about unless somebody delivered that knowledge unto you, because there's absolutely nothing in nature that could ultimately point you to those supernatural things.
That's an interesting claim. I don't know. I guess I have to think about it. But to me, the way I look at, let me ask you this. This is kind of one more question. Where in the teachings of Christ do you see? And I know you're saying, you don't absolutely in every circumstance. There's exceptions and this, that, and the other, circumstance. But where do you see Christ saying that essentially under normal circumstances you have to be a member of a church institution or to be basically
Oh, well,
saved?
I mean, Luke chapter 10, verse 16, when he talks to the apostles who are ultimately going to start the church at Pentecost, he says, those who heareth you, heareth me. Those who despiseth you, despiseth me. So I think that that's a very clear message wherein Christ is sending out the message to the people who are going to start his church, saying, yeah, it's a necessity that people listen to you, because only through you are they going to be delivered the truths of the faith, and only through you are you going to propose certain truths of the faith. But then also later on in the Gospel of St. John, when Jesus says, when he says, just as my Father sends me, so do I send you. Well, that's another instance wherein Jesus is saying, he's saying that, my message, my prophecy, has proceeded to you. It proceeds to you. And now you speak in the person of Christ when you go out and preach the gospel. So that's another, message where if we're trying to figure out the truth of God, and Jesus is saying right there that the people who are going to start his church, the truth of God proceeds through them, just as the truth of God proceeded through him. That's another instance, I would say, that talks about the idea of no salvation outside of the church. But then also, if we go to the first letter of St. John, I believe it's in First John chapter 3. I could be wrong there. St. John, the apostle, says, anyone who is of Christ listens to us. So that's another antecedent where St. John, the apostle, lays down a certain necessity for people to ultimately, be grafted into the message that the apostles are teaching. Ultimately, he's saying there that it is a necessity to be a part of the apostolic church, to be a part of Christ. You can't just go out, do your own thing, and then just kind of hope you roll the dice and get saved. Now, there is the idea that Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange and St. Robert Bellarmine and others talk about, which is the idea of implicit membership, which is the idea that charity is the virtue wherein God's love is poured into our hearts, as I've said before, and it's also what unites us to the other faithful. When we all have charity for each other that proceeds from God, that unites us into the Godhead, which St. Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16. One of the things that someone like St. Robert or Father Garrigou-Lagrange would say is, if a person has charity, in some instances, that can ultimately make them implicit members of the church, to where they may not be going to the Catholic Church every Sunday and receiving the sacraments, but because they have charity for God and their neighbor, ultimately the love of God is still being poured into their hearts and is still being still proceeding from from God through the other members to them, and thus they are implicitly a part of the church. However, it is still ultimately a necessity to be a part of the visible church.
Mhm. Well, I guess the I don't know if you want to call it assumption or not, is that the Roman or the Catholic Church of your choice, because there are obviously multiple Catholic churches claiming to be the Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox claim to be the Apostolic Church. The Roman Catholic Church claims the idea is that you have actually chosen that correct church, right? So you wouldn't disagree with that, though, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that necessarily. I would say that, again, like I just said, a person can implicitly be a member of the church through charity. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Granny lives in West Virginia. Now, West Virginia is a very Methodist state. So let's say Granny goes to a Methodist church every Sunday. She loves God. She loves God with all her heart. She prays the Our Father. She prays to God all the time. She has a great relationship with God. Maybe she's learned a little bit about the Catholic Church, but she doesn't know a lot about the Catholic Church. Like she's heard about it because she's an American citizen, but she's never really looked too much into it. She knows some of the basic views on Mary and the Eucharist and other stuff, but she doesn't really think too much about it. But she, loves God and strives to love her neighbor. Is Granny going to go to hell because she was in a Methodist church? We would say no. We would say in that situation, ultimately, because Granny had charity, Granny is ultimately an implicit member of the church. Now, Granny is still a member of the church. Ultimately, God has still poured out his grace to a point where that charity proceeds from him through the members of the church, both visible and invisible, to Granny, who is not a part of the visible church. So ultimately, the church is still playing a role in ultimately delivering the faith and to her. But at the same time, Granny isn't being dinged because she wasn't in the true church. However, it is still necessary that a person be a part of the visible church. So somebody who, let's say, is a Calvinist pastor or a Baptist pastor who has done a sufficient amount of research into the Catholic Church and has an animosity towards the Catholic Church. I won't name names because I don't want to despair over anybody's salvation. But you've probably seen people on YouTube and Instagram that are Baptist pastors that will have these fiery anti-Catholic sermons. Those people, have actively chosen to reject the faith as it was delivered to them, and ultimately, because of that, they've cut themselves off from the charity of Christ, which ultimately prevents the overflowing of grace. So in that manner, we would say, yes, they're not a part of the church and they're going to be judged for that. But that's much different than, say, someone who has charity, loves God, goes to
Yeah.
maybe doesn't go to a Catholic church, but still has that level of charity. So it's not an idea of, whoops, you chose the wrong church. If you have charity, you're going to be saved. If you die in a state of charity, you're going to be saved no matter what.
That's interesting. I wonder if that's in line with like official Catholic doctrine, or if that's Eastern Thomas's spin on it.
No,
But
it
you're
absolutely
probably
is.
right.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is, especially if you read the Catechism and you read, you read Pope St. John Paul II. He's a recent pope. A lot of his views completely concur the same. Pope Benedict XVI concurred the same. But also all the major Catholic thinkers of the church. St. Robert Bellarmine, I mean, he was the guy on the front lines defending the Catholic Church during the Protestant quote unquote Reformation. He started the Counter Reformation. He concurred the exact same thing. So this is absolutely mainstream, Catholic teaching, even going back to the early church with people like St. Augustine. But I think the doctrine of it was perfected with St. Thomas Aquinas. It wasn't introduced by St. Thomas. But it was definitely perfected by St. Thomas.
Hmm. All right, well, we're closing in on 3 hours here, so I'm gonna shut things down. And as usual, I know there's obviously a lot more that could be said about just about everything, but we can't go on forever. So, feel free to provide a couple minutes of closing remarks, and then we will close down the stream.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just kind of summarize what I was saying before, which is ultimately, faith proceeds from knowing. Faith is not an internal disposition. It is an assent to something that a person has proposed previously. And therefore, that proposal must proceed from certain knowledge. Now, this is why we would say that the Bishop of Rome position is ultimately necessary, and this is why we would say that the papacy is ultimately necessary, because there has to be a first and final proposal of faith, a preeminent proposal of faith, which is certain to the point that all members of the church can unanimously assent to that claim, ultimately ensuring unity within the church. I think that this is necessary for Christianity to be operative in general. If that didn't exist, if that rule didn't exist or wasn't around, I think you'd have an infinite regression of faith. You would have certain questions about certain doctrines which can only be understood by mere opinion. For example, how many books are in the Bible? Well, without a preeminent antecedent, that is a question that is of mere opinion. Without, when it comes to, other questions of faith, was Jesus being serious about the Eucharist? Without a preeminent proposal of faith, the answer to that question, one way or the other, ultimately becomes it ultimately regresses into human opinion. And so, because of that preeminent proposal of faith that all members of the faithful ascend to, must exist within the church for Christianity to be true and viable. With that being said, thank you again, as always, Ace, for inviting me onto your channel.
Yeah, thank you for joining and participating. All right, until next time, Thomas. Yeah, that was. I did learn a few things there, but also a lot of it was in line with. So for me, someone who is not steeped in Roman Catholic theology, there are things that I can learn, and some of it was just stuff that I wanted to confirm, had maybe thought but wasn't sure about. If you remember this conversation with Thomas, we discussed other things before that, a number of other things, but just there was a lot of things to discuss that I think are relevant from that conversation. It started with the idea that in Mark, the ending of that gospel was an interpolation, which I think is pretty well established. But the reason that there's an interpolation isn't just to provide an entertaining ending. There are obviously people who wanted to establish doctrine. Oh, objective ethics is here. Good to see you there. And one of those doctrines, I believe, was the idea that of you can't be saved without being baptized. Now, again, we just hashed all this out. You heard Eastern Thomas' take on it, but if I share my screen here, let's just go back to it really quickly. And again, I'm not gonna go on forever because we've already talked about all this, but I do kind of want to show what I'm talking about. So we have this long ending of Mark, as it's called, and it's heavily disputed. And it's like, why would anyone put this in here? And I think there's a couple of reasons. But one of them, I think, is pretty obvious. I mean, read verse 16, which is one of the interpolated verses. He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved, but he who has been disbelieved shall be condemned. So clearly, if they're adding this verse, and it appears to me that this verse is an addition from several centuries after the time of Christ, based on the manuscript evidence, this is the point where they're trying to establish the doctrine of baptismal salvation. And again, this is also probably at a time when they're teaching, just like Thomas said, that only the ministers of the church can perform a baptism. So we see this accumulation, this attempt to accumulate power within an institution, which is ultimately run by human. Now, you can say it's ordained by God and established by God in a spiritual sense, but ultimately, if you just look at the historical information, it's ultimately men who are making the decisions. You can't really confirm that any of them is being guided by some sort of Holy Spirit or God or active principle of truth. So it just appears to me that this is all part of the superstructure being constructed in the early church that became the Catholic Church, which is the force that essentially corrupted Christianity and made it the monstrosity that it is. Now, that doesn't mean that Catholics today are bad people, they're not Christian, or that they're even unsaved. A lot of them don't know all this, and they obviously, if they even did know it, they wouldn't agree with it, as we heard. But this is what it appears like to me. So ultimately, based on everything you said, we hear that there are circumstances where you don't have to be a member of the church, but really, if you kind of do have to be a member of the church, and if you're not a member of the church, then you're in trouble. And you don't 100% of the time need the sacraments, but it's kind of how God decided to do things, and the church is minister. So I think this is an idea that was established in the early Catholic Church to get people to believe that unless you're being mediated in your relationship to God by a human institution, salvation is at the very least much less likely for you. And if people actually believe that, then obviously they're going to assent to whatever it is you're doing and afford you a certain kind of power. And I do think that people abuse that power very much, including just teaching people that that idea is correct, and then basically enslaving their minds to this institution instead of just teaching them that your relationship is between you and God. So this is one of the many reasons I think the Catholic Church is dangerous, not in the sense that it doesn't teach anything that is true, but that it kind of manipulates the truth to its own advantage and power. And also it created the idea of the modern canon, which includes the epistles of Paul, which are just the grossest distortion of all in the history of Christianity. So for Christianity to be truly reformed, we need to at least take these things into consideration and recognize that we need to go back to the origin. You can point to verses of Jesus saying, you need to believe the apostles. Yeah, but does that mean you need to belong to an institution with ministers and presbyters and presbyters and priests and things like that? It's kind of a stretch to me. I'm not saying it's not necessarily false. It's just a definite stretch to just say the teachings of Jesus are sufficient. And these truths that Jesus taught were basically existing at all times throughout eternity. Sure, you can say the church aids people, and that's its function, to aid people. But even if the church didn't exist, those truths would still exist. And if people didn't know them, then they would still be operative just at an unknown level. And the thing is, to talk about the uncertainty that arises from not having this kind of foundation that is the church. Yes, there's always uncertainty. Even with the church, there's uncertainty. You can say the church gives you a certain assurance that your doctrines are correct. But again, your faith then is just offset from unknown things to the church gets this right because God, guided the church to all truth. It's still a faith. It's still uncertain. It's just the illusion of certainty that people create within their own minds. And it happens throughout all levels of Christianity and all religions. It's just people trying to say that, well, what I believe is kind of faith, but it's not really because of this. It basically is a certainty, and I have assurance of salvation. I'm going to heaven, and my church is a true one. This isn't just something that Christians do, but Muslims and Mormons, and I'm sure people of all faiths, Jews, and things like that. They're all saying the same things. Their institution is the true one for reasons. But unfortunately, certainty is impossible in this world. There's no certainty. There is though truth, even if we aren't certain of it. So that's why I should say I believe things. Some of them I'm pretty certain are true, but there are some things I believe about my faith that are absolutely just that, faith. I can't prove them or demonstrate them rationally in any way. And I guess when I die, I'll either figure out that I was right, or I'll go into oblivion, like the skeptics and atheists say, and won't have mattered anyways. Have you looked into modern scholars who are positing that Paul was actually written by Marcion? 10 of the levers, 10. Yeah, actually, I have thought about this objective ethics. People have alleged that Marcion wrote the Pauline epistles for a long time. I actually don't believe it's true. I don't believe Marcion wrote the Pauline epistles. I don't think he wrote any of them. Did he manipulate them? I think that's much more likely. I think that Marcion probably was a big fan of Paul, and he collected Pauline epistles that were circulating in his time, and it's highly probable that they were manipulated by Marcion and his group, and unfortunately, some of that was inherited by the modern what became the church, and translated all the way to today. But when I read things that Marcion wrote himself, which he wrote something. I remember thinking to myself that Marcion's writing style is very different from the Pauline epistles. And that, to me, is one strong piece of evidence that Marcion didn't write the Pauline epistles, but rather he collected them and perhaps edited and redacted them slightly. But it's an interesting claim. It can't entirely be ruled out just because the history is so obscure and the data is so minuscule. But I think the idea that Marcion wrote the Pauline epistles is it's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's certainly unlikely in my opinion. I would think at the very least he would have added. Yeah, that's absolutely possible. There's no question he could have made certain minor edits or maybe even significant in portions here and there. But to say he wrote them, I think there are some people who are trying to say he fabricated them whole cloth. I really don't think that's what happened. Yeah, I think if he did anything, he simply probably made some edits here and there. But it's an interesting claim, and as I said, it can't be entirely discounted. It needs to be at least taken into consideration. But that being said, okay, I've kind of lost my train of thought, and we're over 3 hours. So I'm just going to say this: like and subscribe. And I saw other people having conversations about sinlessness, which I thought was very interesting. Unfortunately, I was conversing. I mean, not unfortunately, but I was talking with Thomas, so I couldn't engage in that. But that is also, I would agree with Dirty. There's nothing stopping you from stopping sinning. Reconstruction of Marcion is impossible. What did he write? He wrote something that he wrote the idea. He wrote a treatise about how the God of the Old Testament is a different God from the New Testament. And I remember when I read that, it struck me as a completely different. The style of writing, even in the English translation, was very different from the Pauline epistles, which makes me think that Marcion is not the author of any of the Pauline epistles, but rather someone who just really appreciated them. Tertullian, he actually called Paul the apostle of the heretics. And the reason he did that is because all of the heretics loved Paul, which is fascinating. Marcion was a massive heretic. He taught the idea that the Old Testament God was an evil God, and that the New Testament God was a different God who was a good God. But Jesus himself, as we know, taught that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are the same God. So we have to reconcile that. No, that's actually not true. There is actually one thing that is handed down to us from Marcion that he himself is attributed to Marcion himself. I can't remember what it actually is called. Oh goodness, let me see if I can find it real fast. Oh man, I'm not going to be able to find it. Not in the short amount of time that I don't want to sit here and babble for the next 3 minutes looking for this. But I'm going to try and do it anyways. What did he write? Gospel? No, he didn't write that. I'm not going to be able to find it. Was it called the? No, it was a testimony of truth. What did Marcion actually write? Let me see if I can find it this way. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe Marcion didn't write anything. Oh, he wrote something called the antithesis. Yeah, I think what Dr. Vincent and Bilby are talking about. What there's an early Chris. There's a writing called the. There's a writing called the antithesis, and I believe it's attributed to Marcion. Excuse me. Here it is right here. Let me share my screen again because I just unshared it. Yeah, this writing here is actually attributed. It's attributed to Marcion. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I have to look into this. It's been a little while since I've looked at Marcion, but I remember thinking that he wrote something called antithesis. I guess this is what they're saying, that they can't reconstruct. I'll have to look into this. An interesting topic. But yeah, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you might be right about this. You might be right about this. It's been a little while, but I think that let me see here. Anyways, yeah, I think it's quite interesting that you have church fathers like Tertullian calling Paul the apostle of the heretics. I mean, that's pretty strong indictment of Paul, that he has this reputation of being very popular amongst the heretical groups, including the Gnostics. And obviously Marcion was a gigantic fan of Paul because his New Testament was just a corrupted version of Luke. Oh, okay. Yes, he also included 10 Pauline epistles with the antithesis, but we don't have his autograph. Oh, okay. You're probably right about that. In fact, I would say, yeah, that's my recollection as well. Okay, you're right about that. So I guess what these scholars are trying to say is that it's very difficult to reconstruct antithesis, which, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Excuse me. Anyways, I was going to end the stream like 15 minutes ago, so I'm going to do that right now without going any further. But this conversation obviously can continue another time. But I do recommend people look into that because I think Marcion's influence in early Christianity is vastly understated. I think he drove, even though he from the outside drove the direction of the church, and decisions that some of the so-called early Catholic fathers decided to do were based on responding to Marcion. Another thing about the Catholic Church is the Roman Catholic Church especially kind of asks this question: do you really think that Jesus Christ is going to establish the center of his church in the home city of the people who conquered the Jews and who conduct the masses in Latin and not Hebrew and Aramaic? That's the last thing I'm going to say. All right. You'll have, thank you for your contributions. Everyone who contributed, watched, like, and subscribe. And God bless until next time.